Forget meteor strikes, forget reactor failures. The real threat on a generation ship is something nobody wants to say out loud. It lives inside the crew. It starts breaking down around day 500. And by the time anyone notices, it is already too late. If we cannot even keep the human body intact, can a generation ship actually survive interstellar travel at all? If questions like this keep you up at night, make sure to give this video a like. Now let's get started. To understand what a generation ship would actually need to survive, we first have to understand why everything we currently are as a species is almost perfectly wrong for the task. Human beings are, at the most fundamental level, creatures of a very specific place. We didn't just evolve on Earth, we evolved with Earth. Our biology is so deeply entangled with this planet's conditions that pulling us out of them doesn't just make us uncomfortable, it begins to unravel us at the cellular level. And the further you go into the details of that unraveling, the more extraordinary the picture becomes. Let's start somewhere that most people wouldn't expect: the immune system. Because what happens to human immunity in deep space is one of the most alarming and least discussed findings in modern space medicine research. On Earth, your immune system stays calibrated through constant interaction with the environment. You breathe in bacteria, you touch surfaces, you eat food grown in soil teeming with microbial life. You get sick, you recover, and your immune system files away that experience like a library building its collection. This constant low-level challenge is not a flaw in the system, it is the system. Without it, the immune system doesn't sharpen. It drifts in space. That environmental input disappears almost entirely. The spacecraft environment is filtered, controlled, and sterile by design, because the last thing you want on a long mission is an outbreak of something. But that sterility comes with a cost that researchers are now taking very seriously. Studies published in journals like Nature and papers produced through NASA's Human Research Program have documented a phenomenon called immune dysregulation in astronauts on long-duration missions. The immune system doesn't just weaken, it becomes unpredictable. Latent viruses that have been dormant in the body for years, Epstein-Barr, cytomegalovirus, varicella zoster, the virus that causes chickenpox, begin to reactivate. Not enough to cause full illness in most cases, but enough to be detectable in saliva and blood samples, enough to show that the body's ability to keep those viruses suppressed is slipping. Now scale that out, not 6 months, not a year, generations. What happens to an immune system that spends its entire development, from infancy through childhood through adolescence, in that sterile, radiation-saturated, microbiome-depleted environment? We genuinely don't know, and that uncertainty is not a small thing. That uncertainty could be the difference between a civilization that reaches another star and one that dies somewhere in the dark between them. And then there is the radiation, because you cannot talk about deep space and skip past cosmic radiation, not because it's a common talking point, but because the latest research has revealed something about what radiation actually does to the brain that should make every single person interested in interstellar travel stop and reconsider everything. For decades, we understood cosmic radiation as a cancer risk. High-energy particles, galactic cosmic rays, solar energetic particles penetrate the hull of a ship and damage DNA. That's real and it's serious. But what NASA's research program, in collaboration with universities including the University of California, Irvine, discovered over the past decade goes much further than cancer. These high-energy particles don't just damage DNA, they physically alter the structure of neurons. They strip the tiny branching extensions of nerve cells, called dendrites, reducing their complexity. They cause inflammation in brain tissue, and in animal studies, exposure to radiation levels equivalent to a deep space mission produced measurable cognitive impairment, memory problems, reduced decision-making ability, increased anxiety, behavior changes that persisted long after the radiation exposure ended. Published research from Charles Limoli's lab at UC Irvine, work that NASA has directly funded, showed that mice exposed to galactic cosmic ray simulations performed significantly worse on cognitive tasks. Their brains showed lasting structural changes. And here is the part that makes this especially confronting. These effects appeared at radiation doses that a Mars mission would realistically deliver. A mission to Mars, not to another star, just to the next planet over. An interstellar journey would expose the crew to orders of magnitude more total radiation over its duration. The question of what that does to human cognition across multiple generations isn't just a medical question, it's a civilizational one. Because you're not just asking whether the crew survives physically, you're asking whether the descendants of the original crew retain the cognitive capacity to actually fly the ship, to make complex decisions, to solve novel engineering problems, to remember why they left in the first place. That is not a dramatic exaggeration. That is the honest scientific question on the table. So where does that leave us? Does it mean interstellar travel is simply impossible for biological humans? Does it mean we're trapped in this one solar system forever, looking at the stars and dreaming of something we'll never reach? Not necessarily. And this is where the conversation gets genuinely exciting, because the scientific community isn't just cataloging the problems anymore. They're actively building the framework for what humanity would need to become in order to make this journey work. And those frameworks, drawn from real research in synthetic biology, genetic engineering, materials science, and neuroscience, point towards something that is less science fiction and more a roadmap. A difficult, extraordinary, multi-century roadmap, but a roadmap nonetheless. We're going to walk through all of it in this video. The biological evolution required, the technological evolution required, the social and psychological evolution required. Because the generation ship problem isn't one problem, it's dozens of interconnected challenges, and each one has a frontier of real science working on it right now today in laboratories around the world. But before we get into the solutions, before we talk about what humanity would have to become, there's one more layer of the problem we need to understand. And it might be the most counterintuitive one of all. It has to do with genetics, specifically with what happens to a small, isolated human population over many generations of reproduction, because a generation ship doesn't just carry people through space. It carries a gene pool, and gene pools, when they're small and closed and cut off from the rest of the species, do something that evolution designed them to do, something that in this particular context becomes deeply dangerous. We'll get into exactly what that is and why some geneticists believe it might be the hardest problem of all right after this. And actually, while we're thinking about the scale of interstellar distances and what it truly means to cross them, if you haven't already seen my video on how long it would really take us to reach another galaxy, I genuinely recommend it. It's on the card above, not just another star, another galaxy, because the numbers involved reframe everything we think we know about distance, time, and what travel even means at cosmic scales. It connects directly to what we're talking about here. The link is in the description and pinned on the comments. Here's the thing about genetics that most people don't immediately grasp when they imagine a generation ship. We tend to picture it like a Noah's Ark scenario, a large group of humans carrying the best of human civilization launched into the stars. But large is relative, and in genetic terms, even a crew of 1,000 people is almost vanishingly small. The concept you need to understand here is called the minimum viable population, the smallest number of individuals of a given species needed to maintain genetic health and long-term evolutionary viability. For humans, estimates vary depending on the model, but serious scientific work on this question including research published in the context of conservation biology and applied to human populations, suggests that the absolute minimum for long-term genetic viability without serious inbreeding depression is somewhere between 160 and several thousand individuals, depending on the time frame and conditions involved. A 2016 study by researchers Cameron Smith at Portland State University specifically modeled generation ship populations and concluded that you would need a founding population of somewhere around 40,000 people to maintain robust genetic diversity across a multi-century journey, accounting for disease events, accidents, and the natural loss of genetic variance that occurs in small populations over time. 40,000 people on a ship for hundreds of years. That number reshapes the entire engineering problem, because a ship designed to carry 40,000 people isn't a spacecraft in any conventional sense of the word. It's a world. It needs to function as an ecosystem, climatically, agriculturally, socially, medically, for a span of time longer than most human civilizations have lasted. And even if you solve the engineering, even if you build something that large and that durable, you still have to solve the genetic problem inside that population over time, because isolation does something subtle and relentless to gene pools. It's called genetic drift, and over many generations, even in a healthy population, random chance causes certain gene variants to disappear entirely, not because they were harmful, but simply because the random shuffle of reproduction didn't pass them on consistently. Genetic diversity that took hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate can erode in just a few generations when a population is small and closed. The downstream consequences of that erosion include reduced immune flexibility, because immune system variation depends heavily on genetic diversity, reduced adaptability to new disease pressures, and increased expression of recessive genetic disorders that remain hidden when the population is large and outbred, but surface when related individuals reproduce more frequently. And here's something even more unsettling. By the time the ship's descendants arrive at their destination, wherever that might be, they would be a genetically distinct population from the humans they left behind on Earth. Not dramatically different, not a different species, but measurably, statistically different. A bottleneck would have occurred, and bottlenecks leave permanent marks in a species' genome. We know this because we've seen it in our own evolutionary history. The human species itself went through what geneticists call a population bottleneck roughly 70,000 years ago, possibly linked to the Toba supervolcanic eruption in what is now Indonesia. At that point, the total human population may have dropped as low as 10,000 individuals, and possibly much fewer. The genetic signature of that event is still visible in human DNA today. Every person alive carries the marks of that near extinction in their genome. A generation ship would deliberately create a new bottleneck, and the people who design that mission, if such a mission is ever designed, will have to decide what they're willing to accept about the genetic future of the people they're sending into the dark. We are just getting started, and I want you to notice something about the shape of this conversation so far. We haven't talked about engine failure. We haven't talked about asteroid collisions or hull breaches or the kinds of dramatic catastrophes that dominate science fiction stories about space. Everything we've discussed so far, the immune dysregulation, the radiation effects on the brain, the genetic bottleneck problem, all of it is quiet, slow, invisible, the kind of threat that doesn't trigger an alarm, the kind that builds across years and decades and generations until one day it has already done its damage. That is what makes the generation ship problem so genuinely profound. It isn't a story about explosions. It's a story about time, about what time does to biology, about what isolation does to a species. about what the universe does to a body that was never built to cross it. And in the next part of this video, we're going to start turning the corner. Because here is what I find most extraordinary about all of this. The science that identifies these problems is the same science that is beginning right now to sketch out what the solutions might look like. And some of those solutions involve rethinking not just how we travel, but what we are when we travel. Stay with me. Because what comes next is where this story gets truly remarkable. Let's talk about tardigrades for a moment. Because if you want to understand where the science of human survival in deep space is actually heading, you need to meet the most resilient creature that has ever been discovered on this planet. Tardigrades, sometimes called water bears, are microscopic animals less than 1 millimeter long that have been found in environments so extreme they shouldn't be able to support any life at all. Boiling hot springs, Antarctic ice, the deepest ocean trenches, the top of the Himalayan mountains. And in 2007, the European Space Agency sent a batch of them into open space. No spacecraft, no shielding, no protection whatsoever, directly exposed to the vacuum of space and the full intensity of solar ultraviolet radiation. They survived, not all of them, but enough to reproduce when they were brought back to Earth. They came home and had babies. How? Because tardigrades carry something in their genome that most animals simply don't have, a protein called DSUP, damage suppressor. When a tardigrade's cells are exposed to radiation, DSUP physically wraps around the DNA like a molecular shield, physically blocking the damage before it can occur. It doesn't repair damage after the fact. It prevents it from happening in the first place. And here is where this stops being a biology lesson about a tiny, almost alien creature and becomes one of the most significant stories in the future of human spaceflight. Because in 2016, researchers at the University of Tokyo successfully inserted the gene that produces DSUP protein into human cell cultures in a laboratory. And those human cells, with this single borrowed gene from a tardigrade, showed roughly 40% less DNA damage when exposed to X-ray radiation than normal human cells, 40%. From one gene inserted into human cells, already working. This is not a theoretical proposal. This is published, peer-reviewed science, and it sits at the very frontier of a field called synthetic biology, the deliberate redesign of living systems using the tools of genetic engineering, a field that, in the context of interstellar travel, may ultimately matter more than any rocket engine ever built, because here is the reframe that changes everything about how we think about the generation ship problem. For most of human history, and for most of this conversation so far, we've approached the challenge of space travel as an engineering problem. Build a better ship, build stronger walls, build more powerful engines, protect the humans inside from a hostile universe. But what if that's the wrong direction entirely? What if, instead of building a ship strong enough to protect a human body that wasn't designed for interstellar space, the real breakthrough is building a human body that is not a fringe idea anymore. That is a direction that serious researchers, published in serious journals, are actively exploring. And the science underpinning it draws from some of the most exciting fields in modern biology: CRISPR-based gene editing, epigenetic programming, microbiome engineering, and synthetic genomics. Let's go through them one by one, because each one addresses a specific layer of the biological survival problem, and together they begin to sketch a picture of what a truly interstellar human might look like. Start with CRISPR. If you've followed biology news at all over the past decade, you've heard the name. CRISPR-Cas9 is a molecular tool derived from the immune systems of bacteria, and it allows scientists to edit DNA with a precision that was simply impossible before its development. The researchers who developed it, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020 for this work. It is now being used in clinical trials for genetic diseases. It has already been used to cure sickle cell disease in human patients, but the applications being discussed in the context of space medicine go well beyond treating disease. Researchers are asking a more radical question: can we use gene editing to preemptively adapt the human genome for the specific demands of deep space? The radiation resistance work with DSA-P is one example, but there are others. Some researchers have looked at the genomes of animals that are naturally adapted to high-altitude, high-UV environments. Populations of humans living on the Tibetan Plateau, for instance, carry variants of a gene called EPAS, one that gives them remarkable efficiency in low-oxygen environments. Their bodies adapted over thousands of years. Gene editing, theoretically, could compress those thousands of years into a single intervention. There are also genes associated with bone density regulation. Genes that, when they function in certain ways, slow or reduce the bone loss that microgravity accelerates. Researchers studying rare genetic conditions like sclerosis and Van Buchem disease, conditions where bone density is dramatically higher than normal due to mutations in a gene called SOST, have identified molecular pathways that could, in principle, be leveraged to maintain skeletal integrity in low-gravity environments. None of this is ready for application to spaceflight crews today. The ethical, regulatory, and technical barriers are enormous, and rightly so, but the scientific foundation is being laid, and the direction is clear. Future space travelers may not just be trained differently and equipped differently, they may be built differently at the genetic level before they ever leave the ground. Now let's talk about the microbiome, because this is a problem that often gets overshadowed by the more dramatic discussions about radiation and genetics, and that is a mistake. Because the microbiome, that vast, complex ecosystem of bacteria, archaea, fungi, and viruses living primarily in your gut, is not peripheral to human health. It is central to it in ways that science has only recently begun to fully appreciate. The Human Microbiome Project, a major research initiative coordinated by the National Institutes of Health that published its landmark findings in 2012, revealed that the microbial cells in and on the human body roughly equal the number of human cells. We carry somewhere in the range of 38 trillion microbial organisms, and these organisms do things that your own cells cannot do without them. They synthesize vitamins, particularly B vitamins and vitamin K, that your body needs to function. They regulate the immune system, essentially training it from infancy to distinguish between threats and harmless material. They produce neurotransmitter precursors, including compounds that influence serotonin production. Roughly 90% of the body's serotonin is produced in the gut, and the gut microbiome plays a direct role in that production. In space, the microbiome changes. We know this from data collected aboard the International Space Station. Studies published in peer-reviewed journals have shown that the diversity of gut microbial communities in astronauts shifts during spaceflight. Certain species become dominant, others decline or disappear. The overall pattern tends toward reduced diversity and reduced stability, and microbial diversity in the gut, just as in a rainforest, is the foundation of resilience. A diverse microbiome can absorb disruption and recover. A simplified one is fragile. On a closed spacecraft, the problem compounds over time. The microbiome doesn't just live in the gut, it lives on every surface, in the air, in the water recycling system, in the food production loop. And in a closed environment, microbial communities can evolve rapidly because the selective pressures are different from anything on Earth. Bacteria that thrive in the conditions of a spacecraft The filtered air, the recycled water, the radiation-tinged atmosphere may not be the bacteria you want living in symbiosis with human bodies. Some may become opportunistic, some may develop antibiotic resistance, which is already a documented concern aboard the ISS. Research groups around the world are now working on what some call the designed microbiome, the idea that for a long-duration space mission, you wouldn't just bring whatever microbiome the crew members happen to have when they launch. You would deliberately engineer the microbial community on board, selecting for species with specific properties, radiation tolerance, stability in closed environments, and maintain symbiotic function with the human host. This is not simple. A microbiome is not a list of ingredients you can assemble and expect to work. It is a dynamic, interacting community that took billions of years of co-evolution with animal life to become what it is. But the science of understanding it has accelerated dramatically in recent years, driven by advances in DNA sequencing technology that allow researchers to identify and track microbial species in ways that weren't possible even 20 years ago. Oxford nanopore sequencing, for instance, can now identify microbial species in a sample in real time aboard the ISS itself. An experiment called MIX, the Microbial Inventory Control System, has already demonstrated this capability on the station. The vision, and this is real, active research, not speculation, is a spacecraft that continuously monitors its own microbial environment, identifies imbalances before they become health crises, and has interventions ready. Whether those interventions are targeted probiotic doses, engineered phage therapy to eliminate harmful bacterial overgrowth, or something more sophisticated, the goal is the same: to keep the biological ecosystem inside the ship, both the human bodies and the microbial community those bodies depend on, stable and healthy across not months but centuries. And here's where it gets philosophically interesting, because when you start talking about engineering the human microbiome and editing the human genome for radiation resistance, and selecting for bone density genes, and pre-adapting the cognitive architecture of future crew members for the specific psychological demands of multi-generational isolation, you are no longer talking about sending humans to the stars. You are talking about sending a new kind of human, a deliberate departure from the baseline biology that evolution produced on Earth. And that raises a question that science alone cannot answer. At what point does that new kind of human stop being us? This is not a rhetorical question. It has been seriously debated by bioethicists, evolutionary biologists, and space medicine researchers. And the answers people give reveal something deep about what they think humanity fundamentally is, whether it is a fixed biological category or whether it is something more like a direction, a trajectory, a story that is still being written. The philosopher and bioethicist John Harris, in his work on human enhancement, argued that there is no morally coherent reason to preserve a particular biological baseline if changing it increases well-being and expands capability. Others, like Michael Sandel at Harvard, have argued that there is something important, something about human dignity and solidarity that gets lost when we begin designing people rather than raising them. I don't think this video is the place to resolve that debate, but I do think it's important to sit with the weight of it, because the generation ship problem, at its deepest level, is not a problem about physics or engineering. It is a problem about identity, about what we are willing to become in order to survive, about whether the civilization that arrives at a distant star in 300 years is still, in any meaningful sense, the civilization that left. And that question, that genuinely extraordinary question, is one that the science is already forcing us to confront, not in the abstract, not as philosophy class thought experiment, as a practical engineering consideration, as something mission planners will actually have to decide. There's one more layer of the biological survival problem that we haven't touched yet, and it might be the most quietly devastating of all. It has nothing to do with genes or microbes or radiation. It has to do with time. Specifically, it has to do with what happens to human motivation when the goal is so far away that no living person will ever see it achieved. We're going to get into that in the next part, because the psychological architecture of a multi-generational mission is not just a human interest angle, it is a survival variable. And the research on what happens to isolated communities over extended periods, drawing from Antarctic winter over studies, submarine crew research, and the psychology of cults and closed societies, paints a picture that is as complex and as urgent as anything we've discussed so far. The question is, how do you keep a civilization motivated across generations when the destination exists only as a coordinate in a star chart that nobody alive will ever reach? How do you stop a ship full of humans from simply giving up? We'll answer that next. In 1972, a social psychologist named Philip Zimbardo ran one of the most famous and most disturbing experiments in the history of behavioral science. You probably know it as the Stanford Prison Experiment. 24 psychologically healthy, carefully screened college students were randomly assigned to play either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison environment in the basement of Stanford University's psychology building. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It had to be shut down after 6 days because within less than a week, the guards had begun genuinely abusing the prisoners, and the prisoners had begun to psychologically break down, not performing breakdown, actually breaking down. What Zimbardo's experiment revealed, and what decades of subsequent research in social psychology have confirmed and refined, is something deeply unsettling about human beings. We are not primarily rational individuals navigating the world through logic and principle. We are, at a profound level, creatures of our social environment. Give us a role, an authority structure, an us and them dynamic, and a closed system with no exit, and our behavior changes in ways that our conscious minds would never endorse if asked in advance. Now, put that finding on a ship, a closed, isolated vessel with no exit, traveling through the absolute emptiness between stars, carrying the same families for generation after generation after generation. What does social psychology tell us about what happens inside that ship over 100 years, over 200? The honest answer, drawn from real research, is nothing good happens automatically. Everything good has to be deliberately, painstakingly designed. Let's start with something called destination psychology, because it's a concept that doesn't get nearly enough attention in the generation ship conversation, and it sits at the heart of one of the most uniquely human challenges this kind of mission would face. Destination psychology refers to the psychological relationship a person has with a goal they are working toward, and the research on human motivation, going back to foundational work by psychologists like Edward Deci and Richard Ryan on what they called self-determination theory, consistently shows that human beings are most motivated, most psychologically healthy, and most behaviorally stable when they have a sense of autonomy, a sense of competence, and a clear connection between their actions and a meaningful outcome. Now think about what a generation ship does to each of those three things. Autonomy. On a closed vessel hurtling through interstellar space, virtually every major decision about food, about energy use, about reproduction, about social roles, about resource allocation has to be regulated at the community level. There is no individual freedom to simply leave, to opt out, to go somewhere else. The ship is everything. The ship is the entire world, and a world with no outside has no true autonomy in any of the ways that human psychology has evolved to need. Competence. This one is more nuanced, but it's equally important. People feel competent, feel genuinely capable and purposeful when the skills they develop and exercise produce visible, meaningful results. On a generation ship, the most critical skill any crew member can have is keeping the ship running, maintaining systems, monitoring instruments, cycling nutrients. These are important tasks, vital tasks, but they are fundamentally maintenance tasks. And psychological research on what's sometimes called the maintenance trap shows that human motivation erodes significantly when work is repetitive, when outcomes are stable rather than progressing, and when the overarching goal is not personally attainable within a lifetime. And then there is the connection between action and outcome. The people who board a generation ship will spend their entire lives, every single day of their existence, working toward a destination they will never see. Their children will never see it. Their grandchildren may never see it. The destination is, for most of the people on board, an abstraction, a story told by elders about why everything they're doing matters, why the sacrifices are worth it, why the constraints are justified. That is an extraordinary demand to place on a human being. And history, actual human history, gives us many examples of what happens when communities are organized around abstract, deferred goals enforced by institutional authority. The results are not always, or even usually, the disciplined, purposeful communities that mission planners might imagine. They are frequently the results that social psychology would predict. Resentment, factionalism, the gradual erosion of the founding narrative, and eventual social fragmentation, the research base for understanding long-duration human isolation doesn't come from space, at least not primarily. It comes from some of the most extreme environments humans have voluntarily inhabited on Earth. Antarctic winter over stations are the closest analog we have to the psychological conditions of deep space. Small groups of people confined to a limited physical space, cut off from the outside world for periods of 6 to 14 months in an environment that is perpetually hostile to unprotected human life. The psychological literature on Antarctic winter over crews is extensive and in places genuinely sobering. Researchers have documented a cluster of symptoms so consistently observed in these isolated groups that it has been given its own name, the winter over syndrome. It includes increased irritability and hostility, cognitive impairment, particularly in tasks requiring sustained attention and memory, sleep disruption, reduced motivation, and interpersonal conflict that escalates disproportionately from small triggers. Crew members have reported intense, consuming hostility toward other members over things as trivial as the way someone chews their food or hums while they work. In an environment where you cannot leave and the other person cannot leave, and you will be sharing a dining table with them for the next 8 months. These small irritations become psychological mountains. Now multiply that by generations. The social scientist and anthropologist Ben Finney, who spent much of his career studying Polynesian navigation and long-distance oceanic voyaging, pointed out something that is deeply relevant here. The Polynesian peoples accomplished some of the most extraordinary feats of long-distance migration in human history, navigating across thousands of kilometers of open ocean in double-hulled canoes, colonizing nearly every habitable island in the Pacific, and they did it without compasses, without GPS, guided entirely by their knowledge of stars, ocean currents, wave patterns, and bird behavior. But here is the critical point about those voyages. They lasted weeks, not generations. The people who launched were the same people who arrived. The psychological contract, I am doing this, I will arrive, I will benefit, was intact. A generation ship breaks that contract entirely. The people who launch will never arrive. They are not voyagers. They are, in a sense, the vehicle itself. That distinction has profound implications for how you would need to structure the society inside the ship, because you cannot rely on the destination as motivation for the people who will spend their lives en route. You have to build a world, a complete, meaningful, self-justifying world, inside the hull of the ship, a world where people live not for the destination, but within a community that has its own reasons for being, its own meaning structure, its own culture, its own traditions, its own reasons to care about the continuation of the mission, even when the destination feels as remote and abstract as a myth. Some researchers have proposed specific social architectures for a generation ship that take this problem seriously. Anthropologist Cameron Smith, whose work on generation ship genetics we touched on in Part 1, has also written extensively about the social requirements for such a mission. His argument is that a generation ship society would need to be designed deliberately, explicitly, around what he calls a culture of purpose, not just a mission objective written in a manual somewhere, but a living, evolving cultural framework that gives each generation its own immediate reasons to participate in the larger project. Think about how the great cathedrals of medieval Europe were built. Notre Dame de Paris took roughly 180 years to construct. The people who laid the first stones never saw it completed. Their children didn't either, neither did their grandchildren. And yet, generation after generation, the work continued. Why? Because the cathedral wasn't just a building project. It was the central organizing, meaning structure of an entire community. Every stone laid was an act of devotion, of participation in something larger than any individual life. The workers didn't need to see the finished product to find meaning in the work, because the work itself was the meaning. A generation ship would need something analogous. Not necessarily religious, the form it takes matters less than the function it serves. But a cultural framework powerful enough, coherent enough, and flexible enough to give meaning to lives that will be spent entirely in transit. To make the journey itself the point, not merely the means to an end. This is genuinely difficult to engineer. Culture is not a program you install. It evolves, it shifts, it responds to events and crises and charismatic individuals in ways that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. Any attempt to over-engineer the culture of a generation ship, to make it too rigid, too controlled, too institutionally enforced, runs directly into the Zimbardo problem. Closed systems with rigid authority structures and no exit don't produce disciplined communities. They produce resistance, resentment, and eventually revolt. The balance required is extraordinarily delicate, enough structure to maintain mission continuity across generations, enough freedom to maintain genuine psychological health and individual meaning, enough flexibility to allow cultural evolution without losing the core purpose. No human society in history has ever been deliberately designed to achieve all three of those things simultaneously. Every society we know of emerged organically through centuries of adaptation and conflict and negotiation. A generation ship would have to get it essentially right from the beginning, because there are no second chances when you are 100 years into a 300-year journey and the social fabric begins to tear. There is a concept in systems biology called the minimum viable ecosystem, the smallest, simplest version of an ecological community that can sustain itself indefinitely without external input. And I want to borrow that concept and apply it to human society, because I think it captures something important about what a generation ship would require. A minimum viable human society is not just about numbers of people, though numbers matter. It is about functional diversity. A community needs people who perform radically different cognitive and social roles, not just engineers and biologists, but artists, storytellers, philosophers, comedians, teachers, healers, mediators, leaders, and perhaps most importantly, people who ask difficult questions and challenge the consensus. Because a community without critics becomes a community that cannot correct its own errors. And in a closed system traveling through the void, The inability to correct errors is a death sentence. Studies of isolated communities, from Antarctic stations to submarine crews to the famous Biosphere 2 experiment in Arizona in the early 90s, where 8 people attempted to live in a completely sealed artificial ecosystem for 2 years, consistently show that when communities become too small and too homogeneous in their thinking, they develop blind spots. They begin to reinforce their shared assumptions rather than questioning them. They stop generating the internal diversity of thought that allows a group to adapt to novel challenges. Biosphere 2, by the way, is worth dwelling on for a moment. It was a genuinely serious scientific project, a 3.1-hectare sealed glass structure in the Sonoran Desert designed to be a self-sustaining ecological system. It had a rainforest section, a savanna, a desert, a wetland, a coral reef ocean, and agricultural land. 8 researchers sealed themselves inside in September of 1991 with the intention of staying for 2 years. Within months, oxygen levels inside the structure had dropped to the equivalent of living at an altitude of roughly 4,000 meters. Food production fell well below projections. Most of the vertebrate species introduced into the ecosystem went extinct. Cockroaches and ants thrived. Ecological systems tend to simplify under stress rather than maintain their complexity. And the 8 researchers, under the combined pressure of caloric restriction, physical labor, and interpersonal isolation, fractured into 2 opposing factions that barely spoke to each other for the final year of the mission. A crew of 8 in a dome in the Arizona desert, with the outside world a window pane away. The implications for a generation ship crew of thousands traveling for centuries in actual space are left as an exercise for your imagination. And yet, and this is the part I find most remarkable, most genuinely moving about this whole conversation, human beings have shown repeatedly and in circumstances that seemed utterly impossible the capacity to rise to exactly these kinds of challenges. Not easily, not without cost, not without failure and loss and revision, but with an ultimate resilience that is, I think, one of the most extraordinary things about this strange, brief, improbable species. We survived the Toba bottleneck. We spread across every continent on Earth using tools made of stone and bone. We navigated open oceans by starlight. We built institutions and knowledge systems durable enough to outlast individual civilizations, and in the last handful of decades, we have begun, for the very first time in the 4-billion-year history of life on this planet, to reach beyond it. That is not a small thing. That is, arguably, the most significant transition in the history of terrestrial life. And the generation ship problem, in all its biological, psychological, genetic, and social complexity, is simply the next chapter of that story. But there is one aspect of that story we haven't addressed yet, and it might be the most technically daunting of everything we've covered, because even if you solve every biological problem, even if you engineer the perfect microbiome and edit the genome for radiation resistance and design the ideal social architecture, you still have to solve energy, you still have to solve propulsion. You still have to solve the raw physics of moving something large enough to carry a viable human civilization across the crushing distances between stars. And when you actually look at the numbers, the real numbers, grounded in real physics, what you find is both more hopeful and more humbling than almost anything else in this conversation. That's where we're going next. If you are enjoying this journey, then this channel was built for you. Subscribing means you'll never miss a deep dive like this one, and a like tells the universe you want more of it. Be part of this community. Let's talk about the nearest star to our Sun, Proxima Centauri, 4.24 light-years away. That number gets thrown around so often in space conversation that it has almost lost its ability to shock. So let's do something different. Let's make it physical. Light travels at roughly 300 million meters per second. In 1 year, it covers about 9.5 trillion kilometers. Multiply that by 4.24, and the distance to Proxima Centauri is approximately 40 trillion kilometers. 40 trillion. Written out, that is a 4 followed by 13 zeros now. The fastest human-made object ever launched from Earth, as of the time this script was written, is the Parker Solar Probe, which reached a peak speed of approximately 692,000 kilometers per hour during its close solar flybies. That is genuinely extraordinary. It is the fastest thing humanity has ever built. At that speed, a journey to Proxima Centauri would take approximately 6,500 years. 6,500 years. That is longer than all of recorded human history. Longer than the pyramids have been standing, longer than the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and every other civilization in the human story combined, and then some. That is the gap between where we are and where we need to be. And closing that gap is a physics problem of a magnitude that makes every other engineering challenge in human history look, if not trivial, then at least familiar in kind. Because we have never built anything, not a dam, not a spacecraft, not a particle accelerator, that operates at the energy scales required to make interstellar travel viable within a human time frame, not even close. So let's walk through what the actual options are. Not the science fiction options, the real ones, grounded in published physics, peer-reviewed engineering assessments, and the honest acknowledgement of where each approach stands today. The first serious candidate is nuclear pulse propulsion. The concept dates back to a project called Orion, which was developed in the United States in the late 1950s and early 1960s by a team that included the physicist Freeman Dyson. The idea was almost beautiful in its audacity. Detonate a series of nuclear bombs behind the spacecraft, use the expanding plasma to push against a large pusher plate at the rear of the ship, and ride the shock waves to progressively higher velocities. Dyson's calculations suggested that an Orion-type spacecraft using thermonuclear devices rather than fission bombs could theoretically reach velocities of up to 3% of the speed of light. At 3% of light speed, a journey to Proxima Centauri would take approximately 140 years. Still a generation ship, but a very different proposition from 6,500 years. The concept was abandoned, partly because of the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear detonations in space. But the physics was, and remains, sound. A more sophisticated descendant of the Orion concept, called Project Daedalus, was developed in the 1970s by the British Interplanetary Society. Daedalus proposed using inertial confinement fusion, essentially tiny nuclear explosions triggered by electron beams, to achieve roughly 12% of light speed, which would put a probe at Proxima Centauri in about 36 years. Project Daedalus was a paper study, not a funded engineering project. But it was a serious one. It took 5 years and involved dozens of engineers and physicists working rigorously on the real design constraints. And the conclusion was clear. There is no fundamental physical law preventing this. The barriers are engineering and resources, not physics. More recently, a successor study called Project Icarus has updated the Daedalus concept with modern materials science and fusion research. Icarus is ongoing, still largely theoretical, still wrestling with enormous engineering challenges, but it represents the continuing seriousness with which a community of real engineers is approaching the problem. The second major candidate is antimatter propulsion. And this is where things get almost uncomfortably exciting, because the theoretical performance of an antimatter drive is extraordinary. When matter meets antimatter, 100% of the combined mass is converted to energy. compared to less than 1% in a nuclear fission reaction and less than 1.4% in nuclear fusion. The energy density is almost incomprehensible. A perfect antimatter rocket, one that could somehow capture and direct all the energy of matter-antimatter annihilation, could theoretically approach a significant fraction of the speed of light. Some theoretical designs suggest velocities of 50% or more of the speed of light, which would put Proxima Centauri fewer than 10 years away from the perspective of an outside observer. The problem, and it is a very large problem, is production. Antimatter is not found in nature in any useful quantity. It has to be manufactured particle by particle in high-energy physics facilities like CERN. The current global production rate of antimatter is measured in nanograms per year. A nanogram is 1/1000th of a gram. A viable antimatter rocket would need, depending on the design, somewhere between grams and kilograms of antimatter to function. At current production rates, producing a single gram of antimatter would take approximately 10 million years and consume more energy than humanity currently generates in centuries. This is not a problem that incremental improvement solves. This is a gap of many orders of magnitude that would require something approaching a revolution in particle physics and energy generation, not impossible in principle, but not imminent either. The third candidate is the laser sail, and this one is particularly interesting because, unlike fusion drives and antimatter rockets, actual experimental work is being done on it right now, with real hardware, real funding, and real results. The concept was first seriously proposed by the physicist Robert Forward in the 1980s. The idea is to use a powerful laser or an array of lasers to push a lightweight sail attached to a spacecraft, accelerating it to a substantial fraction of the speed of light without the spacecraft needing to carry any fuel at all. The laser stays in the home system. The spacecraft carries only its payload, instruments, or, in more ambitious versions, passengers. The Breakthrough Starshot initiative, announced in 2016 by the late Stephen Hawking and the venture capitalist and philanthropist Yuri Milner, is the most serious funded attempt to explore this concept. The proposal is to send a fleet of gram-scale Starship probes, each about the size of a postage stamp, attached to light sails a few meters across, accelerated by a 100-gigawatt laser array to 20% of the speed of light. At that velocity, the probes would reach the Alpha Centauri system in approximately 20 years. The challenges are significant. Building a 100-gigawatt laser array is itself an engineering project without parallel in human history. For comparison, the entire electrical generating capacity of the United Kingdom is roughly 85 gigawatts, pointing that laser with sufficient precision to keep the sail in the beam during acceleration. Engineering a sail that can survive the acceleration without disintegrating. Designing a starship that can transmit data across 4 light years with a power source measured in milliwatts. None of these are solved problems, but the physics is real. The funding, $100 million committed by the Breakthrough Foundation, is real. The research teams are real. And the goal, which is to demonstrate the concept, not to send humans, is realistic within the coming decades. Now, here is the critical point. Breakthrough Starshot and its relatives solve the probe problem. They do not solve the human problem. A gram-scale probe experiences acceleration forces of thousands of times Earth's gravity during the laser push phase. A human being would be liquefied. A ship massive enough to carry a viable human population. Remember, Cameron Smith's estimate was a minimum of 40,000 people would be so heavy that the laser array required to accelerate it to useful velocities would need to be unimaginably more powerful than anything Breakthrough Starshot envisions. The mass problem is the fundamental obstacle, and it connects directly back to everything we discussed in Part 1 and Part 2. because it means the biological constraint and the propulsion constraint are not separate problems. They are the same problem, viewed from different angles. A larger crew means a larger ship, means more mass, means lower achievable velocity, means a longer journey, means more generations, means worse. Genetic bottleneck means more biological degradation, means higher mission risk. And a smaller crew means a worse genetic bottleneck from the start. Every variable pulls against every other variable. The system is deeply, frustratingly coupled. There is a fourth approach that has received serious attention in recent years, and it is perhaps the most elegant conceptually, though it introduces its own profound complications. It is called the embryo ship, or sometimes the seed ship, and it sidesteps many of the mass and social problems of a conventional generation ship by reframing the fundamental question. Instead of asking how you keep a living population alive and psychologically healthy across centuries of travel, the embryo ship asks, what if you didn't carry living adults at all? What if you carried frozen embryos, thousands of them, representing an enormous diversity of genetic material, along with artificial wombs and automated systems capable of gestating, birthing, and raising children at the destination? The genetic bottleneck problem nearly disappears. You can carry the genetic diversity of tens of thousands of individuals in a container no larger than a domestic refrigerator. The mass problem shrinks dramatically. Frozen embryos and automated systems are orders of magnitude lighter than a living, breathing, eating, metabolizing population of 40,000 people. The psychological problems of multi-generational isolation, the social fragmentation, the destination psychology crisis, the Zimbardo dynamics in closed authority structures don't apply in the same way, because there is no living crew to psychologically deteriorate. The concept has been seriously analyzed. A paper published in the journal Acta Astronautica in 2017 by researchers including Cameron Smith explored the genetic viability of such an approach, and the numbers are, for once in this conversation, genuinely encouraging on the technical side, but the ethical dimensions are staggering. The children born at the destination would have no parents in any meaningful sense. They would be raised by machines. Their entire cultural framework, their understanding of who they are and where they came from, would be constructed and delivered by automated systems programmed by people who died centuries before they were born. They would arrive at a potentially habitable planet, having survived the journey precisely because they were never conscious for it, with no lived experience of either Earth or of travel, and no human community around them beyond whatever their artificial caregivers had managed to build. Is that a human civilization? Is that a meaningful extension of humanity into the cosmos? Or is it something closer to growing humans the way we grow crops? Useful, perhaps necessary, but missing something essential about what human life is and what it is for. These are not questions with clean answers, and the fact that they don't have clean answers is not a reason to dismiss the approach. It is a reason to take it seriously, and to think carefully about what our goals actually are when we talk about humanity reaching the stars. Are we trying to propagate the species, propagate the genome, propagate the culture, propagate the experience, the felt, living, conscious experience of being human? Those are different goals, and they may require very different ships. There is one more propulsion concept worth discussing, not because it is near-term practical, but because it represents a genuinely different way of thinking about the problem. It is the Bussard ramjet, proposed by physicist Robert Bussard in 1960. The concept is simple and beautiful. Instead of carrying fuel, use a magnetic scoop to collect the interstellar hydrogen that exists at very low densities throughout the galaxy, compress it, and use it as fuel for a continuous fusion drive. The galaxy is not empty. The interstellar medium contains approximately 1 atom of hydrogen per cubic centimeter on average, vastly less dense than the best vacuum achievable in a laboratory on Earth, but spread across unimaginable volumes. A ramjet with a large enough magnetic scoop could, in theory, collect hydrogen continuously as it traveled, feeding it into a fusion reactor that accelerates the ship further, which allows it to scoop more hydrogen, which generates more thrust. The appeal is obvious. A Bussard ramjet could theoretically continue accelerating indefinitely, reaching velocities close to the speed of light with no limit on fuel. At relativistic speeds, time dilation kicks in. Time passes more slowly for the crew relative to Earth-based observers, and a journey that takes thousands of years from Earth's perspective might take only decades from the crew's perspective. The challenges, as subsequent analysis by physicists including John Ford revealed, are severe. The density of interstellar hydrogen is so low that the drag from the magnetic scoop may actually exceed the thrust generated by the fusion reactor. The fusion of proton-proton chains, the type of fusion needed to use interstellar hydrogen, is extraordinarily difficult to sustain under controlled conditions. And the engineering of a magnetic scoop, thousands of kilometers across, is, to put it mildly, beyond anything we currently know how to build. But the concept contributed something important to the physics conversation. It demonstrated that there are approaches to the propulsion problem that don't rely entirely on carrying fuel from home. The galaxy itself, if you can access it cleverly, may contain the energy needed to cross it. And this brings us to what I think is the most important framing shift in this entire conversation. Because we have now walked through the biological problems, the genetic problems, the psychological problems, and the propulsion problems. And in each case, the same pattern has emerged. The problem, looked at straight on, appears insurmountable, but when you shift the frame slightly, when you ask not how do we protect humans from space, but how do we adapt humans for space? Not how do we carry fuel, but how do we use the environment we're traveling through? The problem looks different, not solved, but differently bounded. The generation ship, as conventionally imagined, a big metal tube full of baseline humans eating regular food and breathing recycled air and hoping the social structure holds together for 3 centuries, probably cannot survive an interstellar journey. The biological degradation is too severe, the genetic bottleneck too damaging, the psychological demands too extreme, and the propulsion requirements too enormous. But a mission that incorporates engineered biology, designed microbiomes, synthetic biology tools, deliberately architected social systems, and propulsion concepts grounded in real physics, that mission looks less like science fiction and more like engineering, extraordinarily difficult engineering. Engineering that may take centuries to mature, but engineering nonetheless. And there is one more dimension to this that we haven't explored yet, because everything we've discussed so far assumes that the goal is to arrive at the destination with humans who are, in some meaningful sense, still recognizably human, still biological, still carbon-based, still thinking in the general architecture that evolution gave us. But what if that assumption is itself the problem? What if the most important question isn't how to get biological humans to another star, but whether biological humans are the right vehicle for interstellar travel at all? That conversation about artificial intelligence, about mind uploading, about the possibility of sending not bodies but minds across the void, is one that serious scientists and philosophers are already having. And it may be the most radical reframe of everything we've discussed so far. We'll get into it next. On the 2nd of September 1993, a woman named Jane Poynter walked out of a glass and steel dome in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona, squinting into the sunlight after spending exactly 2 years sealed inside an artificial world. she had lost roughly 16 kilograms of body weight. Her blood oxygen had dropped to levels that would trigger emergency protocols at any hospital on Earth. She and her 7 crewmates had spent the final months of the mission in a state of persistent, low-grade cognitive impairment, slower reaction times, reduced memory consolidation, emotional volatility that they only fully appreciated in retrospect once they were back in normal atmosphere and their mental clarity returned. Biosphere 2 had failed. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, nobody died, and the mission completed its intended 2-year duration, but by almost every metric of its stated goal, to demonstrate that a completely self-sustaining, closed ecological system could support human life indefinitely, it had fallen short, and the reasons it fell short are so deeply instructive for the generation ship conversation that they deserve careful attention, because they reveal something fundamental about the relationship between biology and engineering that tends to get glossed over in the more optimistic accounts of long-duration space travel. The oxygen crisis was the most visible symptom. Biosphere 2's atmosphere was carefully calibrated at the start of the mission to match Earth's, roughly 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, trace amounts of everything else. Within the first year, the oxygen concentration began to drop. By the middle of the second year, it had fallen to around 14.2%, equivalent to the atmospheric oxygen level at an altitude of roughly 4,000 meters above sea level. High enough to cause altitude sickness, high enough to impair cognition, high enough that the project management eventually made the controversial decision to pump in supplemental oxygen from outside, a direct violation of the closed system principle that was the entire point of the experiment. What was consuming the oxygen? The culprit, identified after extensive investigation, was microbial activity in the unusually rich, carbon-heavy soils that had been used in Biosphere 2's agricultural zones. Microbes were oxidizing the organic carbon in the soil at a rate that overwhelmed the photosynthetic oxygen production of the plants. The system that was supposed to breathe for the crew was being quietly suffocated by the invisible ecosystem in the dirt beneath their feet. This is not a story about bad engineering. The Biosphere 2 team was genuinely talented and genuinely serious. It is a story about the irreducible complexity of living systems, about the fact that biology, at every scale from the microbial to the ecological, does not behave like a machine. It does not respond predictably to initial conditions. It evolves, it adapts, it finds pathways and equilibria that no designer anticipated, and sometimes those unanticipated pathways run directly counter to the goals of the designers. On the International Space Station, life support works. It has worked continuously and reliably since the first crew arrived in November of 2000. The Environmental Control and Life Support System, ECLSS, maintains air composition, removes carbon dioxide, recycles water, manages temperature and humidity, and has kept human beings alive in low Earth orbit for over 2 decades. But the ISS life support system is not a closed loop, not fully, not even close. The station requires regular resupply missions, on average several tons of supplies per year, that bring consumables, replacement parts, food, and other materials that the onboard systems cannot generate. The water recovery system, which recycles urine and condensate back into drinking water, is genuinely impressive technology. It achieves a recovery rate of approximately 93%, meaning for every 100 liters of water put into the system, roughly 93 liters come back out as potable water. The remaining 7% is lost as waste. On a mission to the International Space Station, that 7% loss is manageable because resupply is a few months away at most. On a generation ship, 7% loss per cycle, compounded across decades and centuries, is fatal. The arithmetic is unforgiving. Even a system that is 99% efficient at water recovery will, over a century, lose enormous quantities of a resource that has absolutely no possibility of replacement or resupply. This is the thermodynamic reality that every closed-loop life support system must eventually face. The second law of thermodynamics, the law that says entropy in a closed system always increases, does not make exceptions for good intentions or clever engineering. Every cycle of recycling, every metabolic process, every act of eating and breathing and excreting moves the system incrementally toward disorder. The challenge of life support on a generation ship is not just engineering a system that works. It is engineering a system that works for centuries, without degradation, without the cumulative losses that thermodynamics guarantees will occur in any imperfect recycling process. No such system exists, not even close. The most advanced closed-loop life support research being conducted today at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, at ESA's MELISA project in Barcelona, at research facilities in Japan and Russia, is working towards systems that approach but do not reach the 100% closure that would be required for truly indefinite operation without resupply. MELISA is worth understanding in some detail because it represents the most serious, most sustained attempt in the world to engineer a biologically based closed-loop life support system. MELISA stands for Micro-Ecological Life Support System Alternative. It has been running as an ESA-funded research project since 1989. That is over 3 decades of continuous, iterative work by teams of scientists across multiple European institutions. The MELISA concept is based on a compartmentalized ecosystem, not a mechanical recycling system, but a biological one. Organic waste produced by the crew passes through a series of biological compartments, each inhabited by specific microbial communities. In the first compartment, anaerobic bacteria break down waste materials, including fecal matter and food scraps, into simpler compounds, fatty acids, ammonia, carbon dioxide. In the second compartment, different bacteria process those compounds further. In the third, photosynthetic bacteria, cyanobacteria, use light energy to convert the remaining compounds into biomass and release oxygen. In the fourth compartment, higher plants, including food crops, grow in the nutrient-rich water produced by the earlier compartments, producing food and further enriching the oxygen supply. And the crew themselves are the final compartment, consuming food and oxygen and producing waste that feeds back into the beginning of the cycle. The elegance of this approach is real. By using living organisms rather than mechanical processes to do the work of recycling, MELISA takes advantage of billions of years of evolutionary optimization. Microbes are extraordinarily efficient chemical processors. Cyanobacteria have been producing oxygen and fixing nitrogen for over 2.5 billion years. These are not experimental technologies. They are the most proven biological systems on Earth. The challenge is stability. A biological system is not a machine. The microbial communities in each compartment evolve over time. They respond to changes in temperature, light, chemical composition, and microbial immigration from other compartments, maintaining the specific community composition needed for each stage of the process, preventing competitive exclusion, preventing invasion by unwanted species, preventing the kind of runaway microbial dynamics that collapsed Biosphere 2's oxygen balance, requires continuous monitoring and intervention. MELISA has made genuine progress. Pilot facilities have demonstrated closed-loop operation with rats and in limited trials with human volunteers for short periods, but as of the most recent published results, a fully closed, fully autonomous, human-supporting MELISA-type system remains a research goal rather than an achieved reality. The technical readiness level, the scale used by space agencies to assess how close a technology is to operational deployment, is still well below what would be needed for a generation ship. Food is perhaps the most psychologically significant variable in long-duration space life support, and not just for nutritional reasons. The anthropologist and food historian Richard Wrangham has argued, compellingly and with substantial archaeological evidence, that cooking and food sharing are foundational to human sociality. The shared meal is one of the oldest and most universal human bonding rituals. Food preferences, food traditions, and food culture are among the most durable markers of identity in any human community. On a generation ship, food culture would be shaped, inevitably and profoundly, by what the life support system can produce. And what a closed-loop biological system can reliably produce is a relatively narrow range of crops optimized for efficiency, high yield per unit area, rapid growth cycles, nutritional completeness, and tolerance for the specific growing conditions achievable inside a spacecraft. The leading candidates identified by space agriculture researchers include potatoes, sweet potatoes, soybeans, wheat, rice, peanuts, and leafy greens like lettuce and spinach. These are nutritious, productive, and well-studied. They are not a particularly exciting cuisine. Across generations, the cultural memory of Earth food, of variety, of seasonal abundance, of the thousands of ingredients and preparations that constitute human culinary tradition, would fade. The diet of a generation ship crew 200 years into the mission might bear as much resemblance to the diet of the founding generation as the diet of a medieval European peasant bears to a 21st century restaurant menu. Technically adequate, culturally impoverished, this matters not just as a quality of life issue, though it matters enormously as that, but as a social cohesion issue. Food is a vector of cultural identity. When communities share food, they share something deep about who they are and where they come from. When the food itself is constrained, homogenized, and disconnected from any tradition, something in the social fabric thins. Research on long-duration missions has consistently found that food quality and variety rank among the highest-rated factors affecting crew morale and psychological well-being. Astronauts on the International Space Station report that food, specifically the occasional treat, the food package from home, the special meal on a birthday or holiday, has outsized emotional significance relative to its caloric value. On a mission where there are no packages from home, no holidays connecting to an external world, and no variety beyond what the agricultural system produces, that emotional dimension of food would need to be replaced by something else. There are approaches to the food problem that go beyond conventional agriculture, and some of them are genuinely exciting. Single-cell protein, food produced by culturing microorganisms rather than growing multicellular plants, has been seriously studied since the 1960s, and recent advances in synthetic biology have dramatically expanded its potential. Microorganisms like the cyanobacterium spirulina and the bacterium Methylococcus capsulatus can convert simple inputs, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, water, minerals into protein-rich biomass with extraordinary efficiency. Spirulina is roughly 60 to 70% protein by dry weight, compared to about 20% for most meat sources. It grows rapidly, requires no soil, and can be cultivated in thin layers using artificial light. The Finnish food company Solar Foods has developed a process for producing a protein powder called solen from carbon dioxide, water, and electricity, using hydrogen oxidizing bacteria to synthesize food essentially from air and energy. In 2021, the European Food Safety Authority approved Solane for human consumption. The process requires no arable land, no photosynthesis, and no conventional agricultural inputs. Its closed-loop credentials are, on paper, impressive. Lab-grown meat, cultured from animal stem cells in bioreactors, is another technology that has moved from speculative to commercially nascent in the last decade. The first lab-grown beef burger was demonstrated in 2013 by the Dutch researcher Mark Post. By the early 2020s, several companies had achieved regulatory approval for cultured meat products in various jurisdictions. The caloric and psychological value of meat, both as nutrition and as cultural practice, makes it a potentially important component of a generation-ship food system, and producing it without the enormous resource costs of animal husbandry is directly relevant to a closed-loop life support context. Insect protein is a third alternative with genuine closed-loop credentials. Insects, particularly species like the black soldier fly and the mealworm, convert organic waste into edible biomass with efficiency that exceeds any conventional livestock by orders of magnitude. They require minimal space, minimal water, and can be fed on the organic waste produced by the crew and the agricultural system. In many cultures, insects are already a normal part of the diet. In the context of a generation ship, their ecological efficiency makes them almost a logical necessity. None of these are solutions in themselves. Each comes with its own production challenges, its own nutritional limitations, its own palatability and cultural acceptance issues, but together they point toward a food production philosophy that is fundamentally different from trying to replicate Earth agriculture in space. Instead of asking, how do we grow the food we know, they ask, what is the most efficient pathway from raw materials to human nutrition in a closed system? And that reframing, as we have seen again and again in this conversation, opens up possibilities that the conventional framing forecloses. Water is in some ways a more tractable problem than food, not because it is simpler to manage, but because the chemistry is better understood and the engineering more mature. The ISS water recovery system has demonstrated that high-efficiency recycling of water is achievable in space. The challenge is pushing that efficiency from 93% toward 100% and maintaining it not for months, but for centuries. The primary obstacle to perfect water closure is the accumulation of contaminants over successive recycling cycles. Each pass through the recycling system removes the vast majority of dissolved solids, biological contaminants and chemical compounds from the water, but not quite all of them. Over time, trace contaminants build up to concentrations that affect water quality, taste, and eventually safety. Managing this accumulation without external resupply requires either extraordinarily efficient filtration and purification technologies or biological processing systems capable of breaking down contaminants as fast as they accumulate. Here again, the Melissa approach offers a biological solution, using the natural metabolic processes of microorganisms and plants to assimilate and neutralize contaminants as part of the broader nutrient cycling process. Whether that solution can be made reliable and stable enough for century-scale operation is an open question that current research has not yet answered. Air management is technically the most mature of the three: food, water, air, because oxygen generation through electrolysis of water and carbon dioxide removal through chemical absorbents are both well-established technologies with long operational histories on spacecraft and submarines. The ISS oxygen generation system has functioned reliably for decades. The challenge, again, is not function but closure. The system consumes consumables, produces waste streams, and depends on component replacement that requires resupply. The biological alternative, photosynthesis, is in principle perfectly closed. Plants take in carbon dioxide and water, use light energy to produce oxygen and biomass, and the cycle can continue indefinitely as long as light energy is available. The Melissa project's plant compartment is designed around exactly this principle. The challenge is scale and stability. You need enough photosynthetic biomass to match the respiratory output of the crew, and you need that biomass to remain productive and compositionally stable over timescales. that exceed any controlled agricultural experiment ever conducted. The cumulative picture that emerges from all of this is one of deeply coupled systems: food, water, air, soil microbiomes, human metabolism, waste processing, crew psychology, each affecting all the others in ways that are difficult to predict and even harder to control. The generation ship life support problem is not a set of separate engineering challenges that can be solved independently and then integrated. It is a single, unified, ecological challenge in which every intervention ripples through the whole system in ways that cannot be fully anticipated. This is precisely what Biosphere 2 discovered, and it is precisely what makes the problem so fascinating and so hard. What it suggests, and this is a conclusion I find both sobering and strangely exciting, is that the generation ship's life support system cannot be fully engineered in advance. It must be capable of self-governance, of adaptation, of responding to the unanticipated in ways that maintain overall system stability. In other words, it must, in some meaningful sense, behave like a natural ecosystem rather than like a machine. And building that kind of system, one that is not merely functional, but genuinely resilient, genuinely adaptive, genuinely self-sustaining across century timescales, is perhaps the deepest challenge in the entire generation ship conversation. Deeper in some ways than the propulsion problem. Because we have a roadmap for propulsion, we know the physics, we know the directions of research, we can see the path even if it is very long. For closed-loop life support at the scale and duration a generation ship requires, we are still, in many ways, trying to understand the problem well enough to ask the right questions. But there is one final dimension to this challenge that we haven't touched on yet, and it connects everything: the biology, the psychology, the social architecture, the life support systems, the propulsion, into a single unified question. It is the question of governance, of who makes decisions on a generation ship, how those decisions are enforced, and what happens when the system of governance itself begins to fail. Because a generation ship is not just a vehicle, it is a state, a civilization, a political entity, and political systems, like biological systems, tend to evolve in ways their founders never intended. The history of human political organization is a history of collapse, transformation, revolution, and reinvention. And on a generation ship, there is no outside to appeal to, no external force to stabilize or reset the system. What that means for the long-term viability of the mission is where we're headed next. In 1789, a group of mutineers seized control of a British Royal Navy vessel called HMS Bounty, cast their commanding officer adrift in a small boat with 18 loyal crew members, and sailed away into the Pacific Ocean. The story of the Bounty Mutiny is one of the most famous in naval history, but the part that most people remember, the dramatic confrontation between Fletcher Christian and Captain Bligh, the open boat voyage, the court-martial, is not actually the most interesting part. The most interesting part is what happened afterward. The mutineers, knowing they could never return to Britain, needed to find a place to hide from the Royal Navy. After a series of stops in the Society Islands, Fletcher Christian and 8 other mutineers, together with 6 Polynesian men and 12 Polynesian women, settled on an island called Pitcairn, so remote and so poorly charted that it had been misplotted on British naval maps by nearly 3 degrees of longitude. They burned the Bounty to prevent detection and to foreclose any possibility of escape. They had founded a colony, an isolated, self-governing, self-sustaining community, cut off from the outside world by thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Sound familiar? Within 4 years, nearly all the men were dead, murdered. The Polynesian men, treated as laborers by the British mutineers, eventually revolted. Alcohol, distilled from a native plant called tea root, destroyed the social cohesion that had allowed the community to function at all. Fletcher Christian himself was killed in the uprising. By 1793, only 4 years after settlement, only 4 of the original 9 British men were still alive. The Polynesian men were all dead, and the surviving community consisted of 4 British men and the Polynesian women and children, the community that eventually stabilized on Pitcairn. And it did stabilize eventually after further turmoil and the emergence of a deeply religious communal culture under the influence of one surviving mutineer named John Adams, bore almost no resemblance to anything its founders had imagined or intended. It had evolved under pressure into something new, something that worked for a time, for the specific people in the specific circumstances that existed, not by design. By survival, the Pitcairn story is extreme, but it is not unique. The history of isolated intentional communities, settlements founded on explicit social, political, or religious principles, cut off from the broader flow of human civilization, is largely a history of divergence and transformation. The founding vision rarely survives contact with the reality of isolation. The rules change, the power structures shift, the original ideology gets reinterpreted, diluted, or abandoned entirely in response to circumstances the founders never anticipated. The political scientist Robert Michels identified a pattern in the early 20th century that he called the Iron Law of Oligarchy. He was studying political parties and labor unions, organizations founded on explicitly democratic principles, and he found that regardless of the founding ideology, every organization of sufficient size and complexity tends over time to develop a governing elite. Decision-making power concentrates. The people who manage the organization's day-to-day operations accumulate disproportionate influence. The founding principles become rhetoric that legitimizes the authority of the leadership rather than constraints that limit it. Mitchell's law is not a cynical observation about human nature. It is a structural observation about complex organizations. Managing a complex system and a generationship is about as complex a system as human beings have ever attempted to operate. Requires coordination, specialization, and hierarchy. The people who perform that coordination and specialization accumulate knowledge, relationships, and leverage that translate into power. And power, once accumulated, tends to be defended. On a generation ship, this dynamic would play out in a context with no external checks whatsoever. There are no other political entities that can impose constraints through diplomacy or the threat of force. There is no free press operating outside the ship's information ecosystem. There is no physical escape, no frontier to flee to, no neighboring community to defect to. The only counterweight to the concentration of power is whatever internal governance structure the ship's founders designed. And here is the problem. The ship's founders, the people who designed the governance structure, will be dead within a generation. The structure they designed will be interpreted and administered by people who did not choose it, who grew up inside it, and who have every incentive to interpret it in ways that serve their own interests and the interests of whoever controls the ship's critical systems, the life support, the food production, the navigation, the communications, constitutional drift, the gradual divergence of a governance system's actual practice from its founding documents and principles is not a rare or exotic phenomenon. It is the normal trajectory of political institutions over long timescales. The United States Constitution is over 200 years old and has been amended 27 times, interpreted by thousands of court decisions, and applied in contexts its framers could not possibly have imagined. That evolution has happened within a society with a free press, democratic elections, competing political parties, an independent judiciary, and continuous cultural contact with the rest of the world. All of those external pressures, the ones that push back against extreme drift, would be absent on a generation ship, What would a robust generation ship governance system need to look like? This is not a question with an obvious answer, and political scientists who have thought carefully about it tend to come away with a deep appreciation for how hard it is. The first principle that almost everyone agrees on is that the governance system must be adaptive. A rigid constitutional framework that cannot be amended is a framework that will eventually be broken rather than changed, because circumstances will arise that the original designers did not anticipate, and a system that cannot accommodate those circumstances will either collapse or be circumvented. But a system that can be amended is a system that can be amended in bad faith ways by whoever controls the amendment process. The history of democratic backsliding, the gradual erosion of democratic institutions by elected leaders who use legitimate mechanisms to concentrate power, is full of examples of constitutions being amended into irrelevance. The second principle is separation of powers, ensuring that no single individual or faction controls all of the ship's critical systems simultaneously. In a terrestrial democracy, separation of powers is enforced partly by institutions and partly by the physical and social complexity of the society. In a closed, isolated community of a few thousand people, institutional separation is easier to bypass because the institutions are smaller, less complex, and more susceptible to infiltration by a determined faction. And physical separation, the kind that makes it difficult for a single actor to simultaneously control the military, the economy, the media, and the legal system, may not be possible on a ship where all of these functions are contained within a single vessel. The third principle, and this is the one that feels most alien to contemporary democratic sensibility, is the design of meaningful social roles and meaningful constraints on social mobility. One of the recurring findings in the study of isolated communities is that social stratification, if it emerges, tends to be more rigid and more destabilizing than in open societies because there are no frontier opportunities, no external markets for talent, and no physical escape valves. A person born into a low-status role in a generation ship society with no realistic path to advancement is a person with grievances that cannot be addressed through the normal channels of social mobility. Multiply that person by hundreds or thousands across multiple generations, and you have the demographic preconditions for revolution. Conversely, a society with no meaningful hierarchy at all, a completely flat egalitarian structure, struggles with the coordination and specialization that complex systems require. The engineering of a governance system that maintains enough hierarchy for effective coordination while remaining open enough to prevent the accumulation of hereditary grievance is precisely the challenge that human political philosophy has been wrestling with for thousands of years with mixed results. There is a body of research in political science and social psychology that studies what are called total institutions, environments that control every aspect of participants' lives, including where they sleep, what they eat, how they spend their time, and what information they have access to. The sociologist Irving Goffman, in his landmark 1961 study Asylums, identified common patterns across total institutions, prisons, psychiatric hospitals, military barracks, monasteries, boarding schools, that he argued were structural consequences of total environmental control rather than products of any particular institution's specific culture. Among those patterns, the development of a sharp distinction between staff and inmates, each with their own culture, their own informal norms, and their own strategies for navigating the institution. The development of informal economies and information networks that operate beneath the official institutional structure. The gradual erosion of individual identity as the institution's norms and routines come to define the self, and, perhaps most relevantly, the development of coping mechanisms that are adaptive within the institution but maladaptive outside it, behavioral patterns that make sense in the total institution's specific environment, but that would be dysfunctional in a less constrained world. A generation ship is structurally the most total institution in human history. The degree of environmental control is absolute. There is no outside. The institution is not a temporary situation to be endured until release. It is the entirety of existence for every person on board, from birth to death. Every behavioral pattern, every social norm, every cognitive strategy that the crew develops will be optimized for the specific conditions of the ship. And those conditions are unlike any environment humans have ever permanently inhabited. What kind of psychology does a total institution of this kind produce? We genuinely do not know. We have data from long-duration Antarctic expeditions, from submarine missions, from space stations, from remote research stations, all of which show characteristic patterns of psychological stress, social friction, and behavioral change under conditions of isolation and confinement. But all of those environments have an end date. The crew knows they are coming home. That knowledge, the temporal boundedness of the confinement, fundamentally changes the psychological dynamic. For a generation ship, confinement is not a temporary condition. It is the condition. The destination is not home. Home is the ship. And for the second generation, the third generation, the 10th generation, people born into the ship who have never known anything else, the question of what they owe to the mission, to the destination, to the intentions of founders who died centuries before they were born, is not an abstract philosophical question. It is the central political question of their existence. The anthropologist David Graeber, before his death in 2020, wrote extensively about the relationship between debt, obligation, and social hierarchy. One of his central arguments, developed at length in his book Debt, The First 5,000 Years, was that the concept of debt is one of the most powerful tools for the creation and maintenance of social hierarchies, because it creates an asymmetric moral relationship that is very difficult to discharge. Lie that framework to the generation ship, and something interesting emerges. Every person born on the ship, in every generation after the first, is born into what could be understood as an enormous debt. A debt to the founders who built the ship, to the mission that gives the community its purpose, to the destination that their sacrifice is directed toward. That debt can be wielded as a tool of social control. You owe this to those who came before you. You owe this to those who will come after you. Deviation is not just rule-breaking, it is betrayal. This kind of obligation-based social control is not invented by cynical elites. It emerges organically in communities under stress as a way of maintaining cohesion and suppressing defection. But it has a characteristic failure mode. When the sense of obligation becomes too heavy, when the sacrifice required seems disproportionate to any conceivable payoff, when the destination becomes abstract and remote, and the daily reality of the ship becomes the only thing that matters, the debt narrative collapses, and it often collapses violently. The religious historian Karen Armstrong has written about how prophetic religious movements that mobilize communities around a distant, transcendent goal, tend to go through predictable cycles of founding fervor, institutionalization, and eventual reform or schism. The founding generation believes, the second generation performs belief. The third generation inherits a tradition that may or may not speak to their actual lived experience, and some of them will inevitably ask whether the tradition deserves their continued loyalty, or whether it is simply a mechanism of control dressed up in the language of meaning. On a generation ship, that question, does the mission still deserve our loyalty, or is it a story told by the powerful to keep the powerless compliant, would be one of the most explosive political questions imaginable. and there would be no external authority to resolve it, no interstellar Supreme Court, no mission control that can fly out and mediate the dispute. The community would have to resolve it from within, using whatever social and political tools it had developed, which would themselves be the products of centuries of isolated evolution that no founder had anticipated or designed. There is a science fiction novel, Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, published in 2015, that I want to mention here, not because fiction is evidence, but because Robinson is a writer who does his scientific and sociological homework with unusual rigor, and Aurora is probably the most serious fictional treatment of the generation ship governance problem that exists. The novel follows a generation ship across multiple generations of travel to Tau Ceti, and it does not go well. The deterioration Robinson depicts is not dramatic or cinematic. It is slow, quiet, and deeply plausible. Skills are lost, knowledge becomes folklore, the social fabric develops stress fractures that the governance system cannot repair. By the time the ship arrives at its destination, after 170 years of travel, the community that arrives bears only a faint resemblance to the one that departed, and the question of what to do next cannot be agreed upon. Robinson is not anti-technology, and he is not pessimistic about human ingenuity in general. What Aurora argues, and what the science broadly supports, is that the generation ship problem is not primarily a technology problem. It is a civilization problem. It is asking whether a human civilization, a full, functional, politically complex, psychologically rich human civilization, can be instantiated in a closed container, sustained across multiple generations without external contact or resupply, and arrive at its destination with enough institutional integrity and human capital to accomplish something meaningful when it gets there. That is a question about governance, culture, psychology, and social organization as much as it is about propulsion and life support. And it is a question that our current understanding of those fields gives us little reason to be optimistic about. Not because human beings are incapable of cooperation or sacrifice, but because the specific conditions of a generation ship push every known failure mode of human social organization to its limit simultaneously. But here is where I want to resist the easy conclusion, because the fact that we do not currently know how to solve the governance problem does not mean it is unsolvable. It means we haven't solved it yet. And the history of human political organization, for all its catastrophes and failures, is also a history of genuine innovation, of new forms of social organization that no previous generation had imagined, emerging in response to new circumstances and new challenges. Democracy itself, the idea that political legitimacy flows from the consent of the governed rather than from divine right or hereditary succession, was, for most of human history, a fringe notion that the established powers regarded as dangerously naive. The concept of human rights as a universal, inalienable property of individuals, regardless of their social position, was, 250 years ago, a radical philosophical position rather than a global norm. These transformations happened because specific circumstances created the pressure for new thinking, and specific individuals and communities did that new thinking rather than simply accepting the limitations of what already existed. A generation ship would create circumstances that have never existed before. It would demand political and social innovations that we cannot currently imagine. And some of those innovations, some of the governance structures, social technologies, and community practices that would emerge from the specific pressures of interstellar isolation might be among the most significant contributions a generation ship could make to the long-term project of human civilization. Not in spite of the difficulty, because of it, we are not done yet. There is one more systemic failure mode that cuts across everything we have discussed: the biology, the psychology, the life support, the governance, and it concerns something that does not make it onto most lists of generationship challenges because it operates on timescales longer than most people are comfortable thinking about. It is the problem of genetic and cultural speciation, the possibility that the people who arrive at the destination after centuries of isolation, biological drift and social evolution are not the same species or the same civilization as the people who departed. That is where we go next. If you are still watching, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe. Every day, this channel goes deeper into the questions that matter most and brings you back changed. In 1788, the British government transported approximately 750 convicted criminals to the eastern coast of a continent they called New South Wales. These people, thieves, forgers, pickpockets, political dissidents, came from every corner of the British Isles. They spoke different dialects, they carried different regional vocabularies, different pronunciations, different grammatical habits shaped by centuries of local linguistic evolution in places as far apart as Cornwall and Edinburgh, Dublin and Yorkshire. They had almost nothing in common except the fact that a court had declared them surplus to the requirements of British society and dispatched them to the other side of the world. Within 2 generations, their descendants were speaking a new language, not English, not any of the dialects their grandparents had brought aboard the transport ships. Something new, a dialect so distinct in its phonology, its vocabulary, and its pragmatic conventions that linguists today classify it as a separate variety of English rather than merely a regional accent. Australian English emerged from the specific conditions of colonial isolation, the mixing of multiple dialects in a closed community, the rapid leveling of regional distinctions, the coinage of new words for new realities, and the gradual divergence from the parent language through generations of contact only with each other. 2 generations. That is all it took for a recognizably distinct linguistic identity to emerge from a founding population of roughly 750 people who had been isolated, not in space, not in a sealed vessel, but simply on the other side of a very large ocean, from the society that produced them. Now imagine not 2 generations, but 20 or 200. Language is the fastest moving of all cultural systems. It changes at a rate that linguists can actually measure. There are well-established models of lexical replacement, phonological drift, and grammatical simplification that allow linguists to estimate, with reasonable accuracy, how long 2 related languages have been separated from a common ancestor. The rate varies, but a rough rule of thumb is that 2 dialects sharing the same origin will become mutually unintelligible within roughly 1,000 years of separation, depending on the degree of contact between them. A generation ship traveling to Proxima Centauri at 1% of the speed of light, which is faster than any technology we currently possess, would take approximately 430 years to complete the journey. At the more realistic speeds that current propulsion research suggests might be achievable within the next century or 2, the journey time would be measured in millennia rather than centuries. Even at the optimistic end of the timeline, the language spoken by the crew at arrival would be as different from the language spoken by the founding generation as modern English is from the Anglo-Saxon of Beowulf. Not a dialect, not an accent, a different language connected to its ancestor by historical relationship, but not by mutual comprehension. This is not a problem in isolation. It is a symptom of a deeper process, the fundamental tendency of isolated populations to diverge across every dimension of human variation from the populations they originated in. Language is just the most visible and most rapidly moving marker of that divergence. Beneath the language, the same forces are operating on culture, values, social norms, aesthetic preferences, moral frameworks, and operating more slowly but just as inexorably. Biology, the field of population genetics, has given us a remarkably precise understanding of what happens to the genome of an isolated population over time. The key concept is genetic drift, the random fluctuation of allele frequencies in a population that occurs not because of natural selection, but simply because of the statistical noise inherent in any finite sampling process. When a population is large, genetic drift is slow and its effects are minor. The statistical noise averages out across millions of reproducing individuals. When a population is small, genetic drift is fast and its effects are dramatic. A generation ship founding population, even if we accept the minimum viable population estimates of around 40,000 individuals that we discussed in an earlier part of this conversation, is small by the standards of evolutionary biology. 40,000 individuals is a tiny fraction of the global human population, and the genetic diversity they carry, however carefully it is curated, is a subset of the full range of human genetic variation. Over generations, random processes will begin to alter the frequency distribution of alleles in ways that no amount of careful initial selection can prevent. Some alleles will increase in frequencies simply because the individuals who carry them happen to have slightly more children or slightly more grandchildren than the individuals who didn't, not because those alleles confer any adaptive advantage, but through pure chance. Other alleles will decrease in frequency or disappear entirely through the same random process running in reverse. This is the founder effect operating in slow motion across generations, and its consequences for a population isolated for hundreds or thousands of years are substantial. The physical appearance of the population would change. The distribution of blood types would shift. The prevalence of certain genetic diseases, those caused by recessive alleles that happen to be at elevated frequency in the founding population, would increase. The immunological profile of the population would narrow as the immune system's genetic toolkit, encoded in a region of the genome called the Major Histocompatibility Complex, or MHC, drifted toward a reduced range of variants. We discussed this briefly in the first part of this series. Reduced MHC diversity means reduced capacity to respond to novel pathogens, and on a generation ship, that vulnerability compounds over centuries. But here is the thing about genetic drift that makes it genuinely strange from an evolutionary perspective. It is not directional. Natural selection is directional. It pushes populations toward better adaptation to their current environment. Genetic drift is random. It pushes populations in no particular direction at all. Over long timescales, in small isolated populations, genetic drift can bring to 100% frequency alleles that are actually slightly harmful, simply because the random fluctuation happened to move in that direction before selection could counteract it. This phenomenon, called fixation of mildly deleterious mutations, is one of the ways that small isolated populations accumulate genetic load over time, a buildup of slightly harmful variants that reduces the overall fitness of the population. It is one of the reasons why geneticists studying small, isolated human populations, island communities, remote mountain villages, populations founded by small numbers of colonists, consistently find elevated rates of certain genetic disorders compared to the larger populations those communities originated from. Natural selection, of course, does not stop operating just because a population is on a generation ship. And this is where the conversation takes a turn that I find genuinely fascinating and genuinely unsettling in equal measure. Natural selection operates on variation. It favors individuals whose traits, physical, physiological, behavioral, cognitive, make them better suited to their current environment. On a generation ship, the environment is radically different from any environment in which Homo sapiens evolved. The relevant selective pressures, the traits that confer survival and reproductive advantages in a closed, controlled, artificial environment are not the same as the selective pressures that shaped our species over the past 300,000 years. What traits confer advantage in a generation ship environment? Tolerance for confined spaces and limited mobility, psychological resilience under conditions of extreme social density combined with extreme isolation from the outside world, reduced metabolic rate, smaller, less energetically demanding bodies put less strain on the life support system, high resistance to radiation, which on a generation ship traveling through interstellar space would be a constant, unavoidable environmental stressor, possibly reduced immune reactivity, because in a closed environment with a known and limited pathogen repertoire, the hyperactive immune responses that are adaptive in a diverse pathogen environment might be more costly than beneficial. Over hundreds of generations, natural selection would begin to favor individuals who carry these traits. Not dramatically, evolution by natural selection is a slow process in a long-lived, slowly reproducing species like Homo sapiens. But the direction of selection would be consistent, and consistent directional selection, even weak selection, produces measurable changes over evolutionary timescales. The people who arrive at a distant star system after 1,000 years of interstellar travel would not be the same biologically as the people who departed. They would be smaller probably, more tolerant of confined spaces physiologically and psychologically, more radiation resistant, immunologically different, cognitively adapted to the specific demands of their ship environment, which might mean enhanced capacity for the kinds of routine, procedural, maintenance-oriented cognition that running a ship requires, and reduced capacity for the expansive, exploratory, novelty-seeking cognition that characterized the scientists and engineers and visionaries who designed the mission. Is that Homo sapiens? Is it a new subspecies? Is it something else entirely? The categories of biological taxonomy were not designed for this question, and the honest answer is that we don't know where the line is, or whether there is a line, or whether the concept of a line is even meaningful in the context of a gradual, continuous process of evolutionary divergence. Cultural evolution moves faster than genetic evolution, and its trajectories are even harder to predict. The sociologist William F. Ogburn, writing in the 1920s, developed the concept of cultural lag, the tendency for different components of a culture to change at different rates, creating tensions and dysfunctions when some parts of a cultural system have evolved while others have not. Technology, in Ogburn's framework, tends to change faster than the social institutions and cultural values that govern its use, producing periods of disorientation and conflict as society struggles to adapt to technological realities that its inherited moral and social frameworks were not designed to address. On a generation ship, the cultural lag problem would run in an unusual direction. The technology of the ship would be fixed, or rather, it would degrade over time rather than advance, as components fail and are replaced with imperfect substitutes, as knowledge is lost across generations, as the gap between the expertise required to maintain the ship and the expertise actually available within the crew slowly widens. The culture, meanwhile, the values, beliefs, practices, and social structures of the crew would evolve continuously in response to the specific pressures of the ship environment. The result, over centuries, would be a community whose cultural framework was increasingly misaligned with the technological reality of the vessel they inhabited. Practices that made sense in the founding generation's context might persist as ritualized tradition long after the practical reasons for them had disappeared. New practices would emerge to address new circumstances without any guiding framework connecting them to the mission's original purpose. the narrative that holds the community together. We are going to a new world, we are the vanguard of humanity's future, would be tested, generation after generation, against the concrete reality of living and dying inside a metal tube, with no stars visible and no arrival date in sight. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz defined culture as the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. It is a definition I find useful here, because it focuses attention on the narrative function of culture, the way that shared stories give a community its sense of identity, purpose, and continuity across time. Every human culture is built around narratives, origin stories, hero stories, stories about what we value and why, about what we owe each other and why, about what we are working toward and what it means to succeed or fail. These stories are not static, they evolve, retold in new contexts, reinterpreted by new generations, adapted to new circumstances while maintaining a thread of continuity with the past. That process of narrative evolution is how cultures stay alive and functional across changing circumstances. On a generation ship, the founding narrative, the story of Earth, of departure, of the mission and its purpose, would undergo exactly this kind of evolutionary retelling. But there is a particular vulnerability in the generation ship context that does not exist in earthbound cultural evolution. The people doing the retelling have no direct experience of the original context. They have never seen Earth, they have never breathed unrecycled air or felt natural sunlight or walked on ground that was not manufactured. The story of Earth is, for them, mythology, as remote and as abstract as the founding myths of ancient civilizations are to us, and myths, as the comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell documented exhaustively across cultures and centuries, tend to evolve away from their historical origins and towards psychological archetypes that speak to the present community's needs and experiences. The story of Earth, retold by people who have never been there, across generations of life in an enclosed artificial environment, would drift. It would accrete new meanings, it would lose details and gain others. The specific geography and ecology and history of Earth would be replaced, gradually, by something more dreamlike, a paradise perhaps, or an origin point, or a cautionary tale, depending on the emotional needs of the community doing the retelling. This is not pathological. It is what cultures do. It is how human beings make meaning out of circumstances that would otherwise be unbearable. But it means that the civilization that arrives at a distant star system would carry, as its understanding of its own origins, something that bears only a partial and heavily mythologized resemblance to the actual circumstances of its departure. Its relationship to Earth, to the civilization that built the ship and launched the mission, would be the relationship of a diaspora community to a homeland it knows only through stories several generations removed from direct experience. What would that arrival look like? This is a question worth sitting with, because it cuts to the heart of what we are actually trying to accomplish when we imagine a generation ship. The stated goal of a generation ship is to extend human civilization to another star system, to carry the knowledge, the values, the biological and cultural heritage of humanity across the interstellar void and plant it somewhere new. That is a profound and beautiful aspiration. But if the community that arrives is biologically distinct from the one that departed, if it speaks a language that no one on Earth could understand, if it holds values and beliefs that have evolved across centuries of isolated development, if it understands its own history through myths rather than records, in what sense has it carried human civilization anywhere? It has not extended a civilization, it has created a new one, an offshoot, a daughter culture, connected to its parent by genetic and historical relationship, but not by shared identity, shared values, or shared purpose in any meaningful present tense sense. Is that bad? I am genuinely not sure. The creation of new civilizations is not obviously a worse outcome than the extension of existing ones. The daughter cultures of European colonialism, the Americas, Australia, South Africa, are not poorer for being distinct from the European cultures that produced them. They are different. They have made different contributions, developed different strengths, struggled with different pathologies. The family resemblance is real, but so is the divergence. But it does mean that the generation ship, as typically conceived, as a vehicle for carrying human civilization to the stars, intact and recognizable, is based on a misunderstanding of how human civilization actually works. Civilization is not cargo. It is not a set of files you can copy from one location to another without loss or corruption. It is a living process, evolving continuously in response to its environment, and a generation ship environment is so radically different from any environment in which human civilization has previously evolved that the output of that evolutionary process is genuinely unpredictable. And yet there is something in this picture that I find not discouraging, but almost vertiginously exciting, because what we are really describing when we describe a generation ship and its multi-century journey is the creation of a new branch on the tree of human diversity. Not the preservation of humanity as it currently exists, but the generation of something genuinely new, a human lineage shaped by pressures and experiences that no human lineage has ever faced, a culture built from scratch in the most extreme isolation imaginable, a civilization that, if it survives, will have solved problems that no civilization has ever faced, and in solving them will have developed capabilities, insights, and ways of being human that the earthbound branch of the species has never imagined. The tree of life does not progress by keeping its branches identical. It progresses by variation, by divergence, by the exploration of possibility space through the endless generation of new forms. A generation ship understood this way is not a vehicle for preserving humanity. It is a mechanism for expanding what humanity can be. The cost of that expansion, the loss of continuity, the divergence from the founding vision, the creation of something genuinely alien out of something familiar, is not a failure of the mission. It is the mission. We are, all of us, the descendants of populations that migrated into new environments, adapted to new pressures, and became something their ancestors would not have fully recognized. The San people of southern Africa, the Inuit of the Arctic, the Polynesian navigators of the Pacific, these are not degraded versions of some original human type. They are expressions of what human adaptability can produce when a lineage is shaped by a specific environment over sufficient time. A generation ship lineage, shaped by interstellar space over centuries or millennia, would be one more expression of that same extraordinary capacity. That is the most honest answer to the question of whether a generation ship can preserve human civilization across interstellar distances. It cannot, but it can do something arguably more interesting. It can generate new human civilization, shaped by experiences and pressures that no human has ever faced, carrying forward the thread of human origin while weaving it into something genuinely unprecedented. What remains to be asked, and we are almost at the end of this journey now, is whether any of this is worth attempting given everything we know about the risks, the costs, and the near certainty of outcomes radically different from what the founders intended. Whether the attempt itself has value, independent of whether it succeeds on its own terms, and what the alternative paths, the ones that do not require putting biological human beings in a metal tube for centuries, might actually look like when you examine them honestly, rather than through the lens of the generation ship mythology. In 1977, NASA launched 2 spacecraft that were not designed to go anywhere in particular. The Voyager probes were built for a grand tour of the outer solar system, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and they accomplished that mission with extraordinary precision, returning images and data that transformed our understanding of the outer planets and their moons. But after they completed their planetary flybys, they did not stop. They kept going. They are still going. Voyager 1 is currently more than 23 billion kilometers from the Sun, farther from Earth than any human-made object has ever been, and it is traveling at approximately 17 kilometers per second relative to the Sun. At that speed, it would take Voyager 1 approximately 73,000 years to reach the nearest star system, Proxima Centauri, if it were pointed in that direction, which it isn't. 73,000 years. That number is worth holding in your mind for a moment, because it is the baseline, the what happens if we just keep going with current technology, answer to the question of interstellar travel. It is also, in a very literal sense, the timescale of human prehistory. 73,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had not yet spread beyond Africa and the Middle East. The cave paintings of Lascaux were 40,000 years in the future. Agriculture was 68,000 years away. The entirety of recorded human history, every civilization, every empire, every scientific revolution, every war and treaty and work of art would fit inside the last 1% of that journey. This is the scale of the problem. And when you really sit with it, when you let the numbers land rather than sliding past them, the question of whether a generation ship is the right solution to interstellar travel starts to look like a question that deserves a much more radical answer than we usually give it. Let us be precise about what we are trying to accomplish. The stated goal of interstellar travel, the reason generation ships enter the conversation at all, is usually framed as one of three things. First, the scientific exploration of other star systems, including the search for life beyond Earth. Second, the long-term survival of the human species through the establishment of off-world colonies, reducing our civilization's vulnerability to extinction-level events on Earth. Third, the philosophical and existential imperative to extend the reach of consciousness and intelligence into the cosmos, what the physicist Freeman Dyson called the universe waking up to itself. These are genuinely different goals, and the generation ship is a good solution to none of them. For scientific exploration, a generation ship is an extraordinarily expensive and fragile instrument. The scientific value of sending biological human beings to another star system is marginal compared to what robotic probes, unencumbered by the need for life support, radiation shielding, food, water, governance structures, or psychological well-being, could accomplish at a fraction of the cost and risk. We have learned more about the solar system from Voyager, Cassini, New Horizons, and the Mars rovers than we could have learned from any crewed mission at this stage of our technological development. The same logic applies to interstellar distances, amplified enormously by the scale of the challenge. For long-term survival, a generation ship faces a brutal actuarial problem. A single vessel carrying a few thousand or even a few tens of thousands of people is not a robust backup for a civilization of 8 billion. A catastrophic failure of the ship, a meteor strike, a reactor failure, a social collapse eliminates the entire backup. Distributing the backup across many smaller, cheaper, faster robotic missions carrying genetic material, cultural archives, and the instructions for reconstructing human biology from scratch is a more robust strategy by almost any measure. For the philosophical goal, the extension of consciousness into the cosmos, the generation ship raises a question that we are only beginning to be able to ask coherently. Does that consciousness need to be biological? Does it need to be embodied in flesh and blood and neurons? Or is the relevant thing about human consciousness, the thing worth extending into the universe, something that could, in principle, be instantiated in a different substrate? That question has moved, in the past 2 decades, from the domain of science fiction to the domain of serious scientific and philosophical inquiry. The field of whole brain emulation, the project of creating a complete computational model of a human brain, accurate enough to reproduce the cognitive and experiential properties of the original, remains far beyond current technology, but the theoretical foundations are increasingly well understood, and the obstacles are increasingly specific and technical rather than fundamental and conceptual. The philosopher Nick Bostrom and the neuroscientist Anders Sandberg, in a detailed technical roadmap published in 2008, laid out the computational and neuroscientific requirements for whole brain emulation with unusual precision. Their analysis suggested that the fundamental barriers are not theoretical. There is no known physical law that prohibits the computational emulation of a biological brain, but practical. We currently lack the scanning resolution, the computational power, and the neuroscientific understanding to actually do it. All three of those constraints are moving in the right direction, though the timeline remains deeply uncertain if whole brain emulation becomes possible, and I am not asserting that it will. I am exploring the implications of the possibility. Then the generationship problem transforms entirely. A digital human consciousness requires no food, no water, no breathable atmosphere, no radiation shielding beyond what is needed to protect the computing hardware. It experiences no psychological deterioration from isolation, no immune dysregulation from microbial scarcity, no genetic drift, no evolutionary divergence. It can be copied, backed up, paused during periods of low power availability, and reactivated at arrival. The crew of a digital generation ship could be running in accelerated simulation during the journey, experiencing subjective years of activity for every objective year of travel, or could be suspended entirely with zero subjective experience of the journey, arriving at their destination as fresh and intact as the day they departed. The philosophical objections to this approach are real and worth taking seriously. A digital consciousness, however accurate its emulation of the original biological brain, is arguably not the same person as the biological human it was modeled on. It is a copy, a continuation, a reconstruction, depending on which theory of personal identity you find most defensible. The hard problem of consciousness, the question of why any physical process gives rise to subjective experience at all, remains unsolved, which means we cannot be certain that a digital brain emulation would be conscious in the relevant sense, rather than simply a very sophisticated information processing system that behaves as if it were conscious. These are not trivial objections. They touch on some of the deepest unresolved questions in philosophy of mind, but they do not obviously favor the generation ship over the digital alternative, because the generation ship also involves a continuity of identity problem, in the sense that the people who arrive are not the same people who departed, and the question of whether the arriving community has a meaningful moral claim to be continuing the mission of the departing community is not obviously different from the question of whether a digital emulation has a meaningful claim to be continuing the life of the biological original. There is a third alternative that receives less attention than either the generation ship or the digital consciousness scenario, and I think it deserves more. It is sometimes called the seeds of humanity approach, or more formally, directed panspermia, the deliberate seeding of other worlds with the biological and informational material needed to reconstruct human civilization without requiring biological humans to make the journey themselves. The concept, in its most developed form, involves sending a small probe, much smaller and therefore much faster than any generation ship, carrying a comprehensive archive of human genetic information, cultural knowledge, and technological instructions, together with the robotic systems needed to construct a habitat and eventually synthesize biological humans from scratch. This is not science fiction in the sense of requiring physics we do not understand. The synthetic biology required to construct a human genome from a digital template already exists in primitive form. We can already synthesize DNA sequences from digital information, and the trajectory of that technology is toward increasing sophistication and decreasing cost. The robotics required to build a habitat on another world are within the foreseeable scope of current technological development. The artificial womb technology required to gestate a human embryo outside a biological mother is advancing rapidly, driven by the medical need to support extremely premature infants. Put these technologies together, not today, not within this century, but within a time frame that is at least plausible given current trajectories, and you have a system that could, in principle, send a lightweight, fast probe to another star system, establish a habitat, synthesize human embryos from archived genetic material, gestate those embryos in artificial wombs, and raise the resulting children through a combination of robotic caregiving and artificial intelligence, creating a human community on another world without ever requiring biological humans to survive an interstellar journey. The ethical dimensions of this proposal are genuinely staggering. The children created by this process would not have chosen to be created, would not have chosen their world, and would have no biological family in any conventional sense. They would be, in the most literal possible way, children of the mission, their entire existence shaped by decisions made by people on Earth before they were born for purposes they had no say in. The questions of consent, autonomy, and moral responsibility that this raises are not easy to dismiss. But then again, no child chooses to be born. No child chooses the society, the culture, the economic circumstances, or the planetary environment into which they are born. The Generation Ship child is in a structurally similar situation, born into a mission they did not choose, shaped by decisions made before their existence. The Seeds of Humanity child is in a more extreme version of the same situation, but it is a difference of degree rather than kind. The physicist and futurist Freeman Dyson spent much of his career thinking about the long-term future of intelligence in the universe, and one of his recurring themes was the inadequacy of our current frameworks for imagining what interstellar civilization might actually look like. Dyson was not particularly interested in the Generation Ship concept. He found it too conservative, too committed to carrying the present into the future, rather than allowing the future to be genuinely different. What Dyson imagined was something more like what biologists call adaptive radiation, the explosive diversification of a lineage into new ecological niches when it encounters a new environment. Life did not conquer the land by sending a single representative species to check whether the land was habitable. It sent thousands of experiments simultaneously, fish that developed primitive lungs, amphibians that could tolerate desiccation, reptiles that could lay eggs on dry land, and the ones that worked, the ones that didn't. The result was the extraordinary diversity of terrestrial life that we see today. Dyson imagined interstellar civilization following a similar pattern. Not one ship, not one mission, not one carefully planned expedition, but thousands of different experiments using different technologies, different social structures, different biological substrates sent in every direction simultaneously. Most would fail. Some would succeed in ways their designers intended. Others would succeed in ways no one had anticipated. The result over millions of years would be a galaxy full of intelligence in forms that we cannot currently imagine, descended from Earth life, carrying the thread of our origin, but shaped by the specific environments and specific challenges of their respective homes into something gloriously, incomprehensibly diverse. This is, it seems to me, the honest long-term vision for interstellar civilization, not the generation ship as a vehicle for carrying human civilization intact to another star, not even the digital consciousness as a more efficient way of doing the same thing, but the deliberate, joyful, terrifying acceptance that sending intelligence into the cosmos means sending it into an evolutionary process that will transform it beyond recognition, and that this transformation is not a failure but the point. But I want to come back at the end of this part to something more immediate and more human, because the generation ship discussion is not only a discussion about what is technically optimal, it is also a discussion about what we value, and what we value when we imagine human beings making the interstellar journey themselves, in bodies, not in digital form, not reconstructed from archives, but actually there, actually present, actually experiencing the void, says something important about what we think it means to be human. There is a reason the generation ship has captured the human imagination in a way that the von Neumann probe has not. It is not because the generation ship is the most efficient solution to the problem of interstellar colonization. It is because the generation ship puts human beings at the center of the story. It keeps us in the frame. It insists that the thing worth sending to the stars is not just our genetic information, not just our cultural archives, not just our technological knowledge, but us. Embodied, biological, imperfect, suffering, wondering, laughing, grieving, hoping us. That insistence is not irrational. It is, I would argue, one of the most important things about human beings, this refusal to accept that we can be adequately represented by our data, our genes, our outputs. The intuition that a person is not merely a pattern of information that could be copied and reconstructed without loss, that the individual, unrepeatable, embodied experience of being a particular human being in a particular moment is something that has value in itself, not merely as a vehicle for the transmission of information. The generation ship is, at its deepest level, an expression of that intuition carried to its logical extreme. It says, we will go ourselves, not our representatives, not our blueprints, not our emulations, us, however hard it is, however much we have to change along the way, however different we become from what we were when we started, and if that insistence turns out to be, in practical terms, an insurmountable obstacle, if the biology, the psychology, the governance, the thermodynamics, and the evolutionary divergence all conspire to make it impossible for biological human beings to survive an interstellar journey and arrive at their destination as a functioning civilization, then perhaps what the generation ship tells us in the end is something profound and uncomfortable about the limits of what we are, or perhaps it tells us that the question itself, can we go, is less interesting than a different question. Who will we be if we do? Because here is what strikes me sitting with everything we have covered across these 9 parts. Every single failure mode we have identified, the genetic bottleneck, the psychological deterioration, the life support entropy, the governance drift, the cultural and biological evolution, every single one of them is a consequence on time of the vast, incompressible, irreducible fact that interstellar distances are so enormous that no human timescale solution is available. We cannot get there fast enough to outrun our own biology, our own psychology, our own social dynamics. The universe has set a speed limit, the speed of light, and at any velocity meaningfully below it, the journey takes longer than a human civilization can remain stable. The generation ship problem is, ultimately, the speed of light problem. Everything else is a consequence, which means that the most important question in interstellar travel is not how to build a better generation ship. It is whether there is a way, any way, however speculative, however distant in technological terms, to close the gap between human timescales and interstellar distances. And that question leads us, in the final part of this series, to the most speculative and the most important territory we have covered yet, because there are researchers, serious, credentialed, institutionally affiliated researchers, who are not content to accept the speed of light limit as the final word, who are exploring, in mathematical and physical detail, the conditions under which that limit might be approached, circumvented, or transcended entirely, whose work is preliminary, contested, and mostly far from engineering reality, but whose questions are among the most important that physics has ever asked. There is a moment in every serious conversation about interstellar travel when the physics stops being a background constraint and becomes the main character. We have spent 9 parts of this series examining the human dimensions of the problem, the biology, the psychology, the governance, the culture, the evolution, and all of it, every single challenge we have identified, traces back to the same root cause. The universe is unimaginably large, and we are unimaginably slow. The nearest star is 4.2 light-years away. The nearest potentially habitable world we currently know of, Proxima Centauri b, orbits that star at a distance that puts it within its star's habitable zone, though whether it is actually habitable is deeply uncertain, and to get there, traveling at any speed we can currently produce or plausibly engineer in the near future, would take not years or decades but centuries or millennia. That is the core fact. Everything else, the genetic drift, the psychological deterioration, the life support entropy, the governance collapse, the cultural divergence, everything is a consequence of that fact. The generation ship is not a bad idea because human beings are fragile, though we are. It is not a bad idea because engineering is hard, though it is. It is a bad idea because the universe did not consult our timescales when it arranged its contents, and the distances between stars are simply, brutally, incompatibly vast relative to the lifespan of a human being, a human institution, or a human civilization as we currently understand those things. So the final question, the one this entire series has been building toward, is this: is the speed of light barrier the final word? Is there any path, however speculative, however technologically distant, that closes the gap between human timescales and interstellar distances in a way that makes the journey survivable without requiring us to solve the unsolvable problems of multi-generational, closed-system existence? The answer, as best as current physics can tell us, is maybe. In one very specific, very narrow, very demanding sense. Let us start with what we know for certain, because certainty is rare enough in this conversation to be worth celebrating when we find it. Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity, published in 1905, contains a consequence so strange that it took decades for its full implications to be absorbed even by physicists. The consequence is this: time is not universal. The rate at which time passes is not the same for all observers. It depends on the relative velocity between them. An observer moving at high velocity relative to a stationary observer experiences time passing more slowly, not as a psychological illusion, not as a measurement artifact, but as a genuine physical difference in the rate of temporal passage. The moving observer ages more slowly, their clocks tick more slowly, their biological processes unfold more slowly. From their own perspective, nothing is different. Time feels normal. The body functions normally. No one on the ship notices anything unusual. But from the perspective of the stationary observer, the moving observer is running in slow motion. This is not theoretical. It has been measured. Atomic clocks flown on aircraft returned to Earth, running slightly slow compared to identical clocks that stayed on the ground. The GPS satellite network requires relativistic corrections to function accurately. Without accounting for time dilation, GPS positioning would accumulate errors of kilometers per day. Muons produced by cosmic ray collisions in the upper atmosphere reach the surface of the Earth in numbers that are only explicable if their internal clocks are running slow, relative to our ground-based reference frame. Time dilation is not a prediction awaiting confirmation. It is a confirmed, measured, engineered-around fact of physical reality. The degree of time dilation scales with velocity in a specific mathematical relationship. The Lorentz factor, named after the Dutch physicist Hendrik Lorentz, who derived it in the 1890s before Einstein provided the theoretical framework that explained it. At everyday velocities, even at the velocity of our fastest spacecraft, the time dilation effect is real but negligibly small. At velocities approaching the speed of light, it becomes dramatic. At 90% of the speed of light, the Lorentz factor is approximately 2.3, meaning that for every year experienced by the ship's crew, about 2.3 years pass on Earth. At 99% of the speed of light, the factor is approximately 7. At 99.9%, it is approximately 22. At 99.99%, it is approximately 224. The implications for interstellar travel are profound. A ship traveling at 99.99% of the speed of light, a velocity that requires an almost incomprehensible amount of energy to achieve, but which does not violate any known physical law, would reach Proxima Centauri in approximately 4.2 years of Earth time, but the crew would experience only about 1 week of subjective time, not 4 years, not decades, 1 week. The journey that would require 20 generations of human beings to survive in a generation ship would, at this velocity, be over before the crew had time to unpack. This is the genuine physics-confirmed alternative to the generation ship. Not faster than light travel, not warp drives, not wormholes, just very, very fast sublight travel, exploiting the relativistic time dilation that Einstein's equations guarantee is real. The crew ages by days or weeks while years or decades pass outside the ship. They arrive at their destination biologically young, psychologically intact, genetically unmodified, culturally continuous with the civilization that launched them. No generational turnover, no genetic drift, no governance collapse, no cultural divergence. The physics solves in one stroke every single problem we have spent 9 parts of this series examining. The catch, and there is of course a catch, is energy. To accelerate a ship to relativistically significant velocities, you need energy on a scale that makes every other engineering challenge in human history look trivial by comparison. The kinetic energy of a 1,000-ton spacecraft traveling at 90% of the speed of light is approximately 8.1 times 10 to the power of 23 joules, comparable to the total energy output of the Sun over approximately 2 seconds. The total annual energy consumption of human civilization is currently around 6 times 10 to the power of 20 joules. Getting a modest spacecraft to relativistically significant velocities would require thousands of years of current human energy production focused entirely on that single task. This is not a funding problem. It is not a political problem. It is a basic physics problem. The energy required is genuinely enormous by any human scale of reference, and the only way to address it is through either a fundamental advance in our ability to extract and direct energy, or a fundamental reduction in the mass of the vehicle, or both. The Breakthrough Starshot initiative, announced in 2016 by the physicist Stephen Hawking, the entrepreneur Yuri Milner, and the physicist and Nobel laureate Saul Perlmutter, is the most serious current attempt to find a path through the energy problem. Its approach is radical in its simplicity. Make the spacecraft so small and so light that the energy required to accelerate it becomes, if not trivial, at least within the range of foreseeable human engineering. The Starshot concept involves launching a fleet of tiny probes, star chips, each weighing approximately 1 gram and attached to an ultra-thin reflective sail measuring perhaps a few meters across. A powerful laser array on Earth, with a total output in the range of 100 gigawatts, would focus its beam on the sail for a few minutes, accelerating the tiny craft to approximately 20% of the speed of light. At that velocity, still far too slow for dramatic time dilation effects, but astonishingly fast by any previous engineering standard, the probe would reach Proxima Centauri in approximately 20 years, not thousands of years, not hundreds, 20, within a human lifetime, within the career of the scientists who designed the mission, within the memory of the people who watched the launch. The technical challenges are immense. Maintaining coherent laser focus on a sail that is accelerating rapidly away from the array, managing the heat generated by the laser on the sail surface, stabilizing the sail against the tendency to spin or wobble under uneven illumination, designing electronics robust enough to survive both the acceleration, which would subject them to forces of around 10,000 times Earth's gravity during the boost phase, and the interstellar medium of cosmic radiation and dust particles, and then transmitting data back across 4 light-years on power budgets measured in milliwatts. All of these are genuine engineering challenges with no current solutions, but none of them violate known physics. The Breakthrough Starshot initiative has funded research into all of these challenges, and the results, while preliminary, suggest that a demonstration mission using smaller-scale technology could be feasible within the next few decades. A full interstellar mission, capable of reaching Proxima Centauri in 20 years and returning data about its planets, might be achievable within the latter part of this century. What Starshot cannot do, in its current conception, is carry people. A 1-gram spacecraft with a few meter sail is not a vessel for biological life of any description. It is a camera, a spectrometer, a data transmitter. It can tell us whether Proxima Centauri b has an atmosphere, whether that atmosphere contains biosignatures, whether there is liquid water on the surface, whether the world is worth going to. It cannot go there on our behalf in any sense that involves our physical presence. To carry people to another star at relativistically significant velocities requires solving a different problem, not the energy problem of accelerating a tiny probe, but the energy problem of accelerating something large enough and well shielded enough and well provisioned enough to keep human beings alive and functional during a journey of days or weeks of subjective time that corresponds to years or decades of objective time. The energy requirements scale with mass, and a crewed spacecraft, even a minimally provisioned one, is orders of magnitude more massive than a gram-scale probe. The most promising theoretical approach to this problem involves not an onboard propulsion system at all, but a variant of the laser sail concept scaled up enormously. A ship with a large enough sail, pushed by a powerful enough laser array, could in principle be accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light without carrying its own fuel, which eliminates the devastating feedback loop known as the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, in which the fuel needed to accelerate the ship includes the fuel needed to accelerate the fuel itself, producing exponentially increasing mass requirements as velocity goals increase. The physicist Robert Forward, in the 1980s, worked out the mathematics of a laser-pushed light sail capable of carrying a crewed vessel to a nearby star, and while the numbers are staggering, laser arrays of planetary scale, sails measured in hundreds of kilometers, deceleration achieved by separating part of the sail to reflect the laser back onto the main ship. They are not physically impossible. They are simply far beyond anything our current civilization could build. Whether a future civilization, a century from now, 5 centuries from now, a millennium from now, could build them depends on trajectories of technological development that we cannot confidently predict. And then there are the proposals that most physicists consider either impossible or so far beyond current understanding that they cannot be seriously evaluated. The most famous of these is the Alcubierre drive, proposed in 1994 by the Mexican physicist Miguel Alcubierre in a paper that has become one of the most cited thought experiments in theoretical physics. Alcubierre showed, working within the framework of Einstein's general theory of relativity, that the equations of general relativity permit a solution in which a region of spacetime is compressed in front of a spacecraft and expanded behind it, effectively moving the spacecraft through space by moving space itself rather than by accelerating the craft through a stationary spacetime. A ship inside the Alcubierre warp bubble would experience no acceleration, no time dilation, no relativistic effects of any kind. It would be, from the perspective of the crew, sitting still while space rearranged itself around it. From the perspective of the outside universe, it would be moving faster than light. The problems with the Alcubierre metric are numerous and, in the view of most physicists, fatal. Creating the warp bubble requires exotic matter with negative energy density, which has never been observed and may not exist. Initial estimates suggested the amount of exotic matter required would have mass energy equivalent to that of Jupiter. Later refinements reduced this estimate, but even optimistic calculations require exotic matter quantities that are far beyond anything conceivable with current or foreseeable physics. The bubble, once created, cannot be controlled from the inside. The crew would be isolated from the outside universe and unable to send signals that would allow them to steer or stop. And Harold White's much publicized work at NASA in the early 2010s, which generated enormous press coverage, suggesting that a warp drive might be more achievable than previously thought, was subsequently found to contain mathematical errors and has not withstood peer review scrutiny. The honest assessment is that the Alcubierre drive is a remarkable demonstration that Einstein's equations are permissive enough to contain faster-than-light solutions, but not a blueprint for an engineering project. It is mathematics, not physics, a solution that exists in the equations, but may have no correspondence to anything that can be physically realized. Most physicists who have examined it seriously have concluded that some as yet undiscovered physical constraint will prove to prohibit it, in the same way that the second law of thermodynamics prohibits the construction of a perpetual motion machine, even though energy conservation alone would permit it. So where does this leave us? 9 parts of careful examination of everything that makes a generation ship impossible, followed by 1 part in which we honestly assess the alternatives. And what do we find? We find that the laser sail, in its gram-scale form, is real engineering on a real time scale. Breakthrough Starshot is a funded research program with serious scientists working on serious technical problems, and the possibility of a data-returning probe reaching Proxima Centauri within this century is not obviously unreasonable. We find that relativistic time dilation is a genuine, confirmed physical phenomenon that, in principle, makes interstellar travel survivable on human timescales. If we can ever solve the energy problem of accelerating a crewed vessel to velocities where the effect becomes significant, we find that whole brain emulation and the seeds of humanity approach represent possible alternative paths that do not require biological humans to survive the journey at all. Paths that raise profound philosophical questions but do not face the physical constraints that doom the generation ship. And we find that faster-than-light travel, while not prohibited by all of physics, requires either exotic matter that may not exist or physical phenomena that we do not currently understand well enough to evaluate, or both. The generation ship against this backdrop looks like what it is: a transitional concept, an attempt to solve a post-human problem with pre-human tools, a proposal that takes the universe as it is and takes human beings as we are, and asks whether we can bridge the gap between them with engineering alone, and finds, on careful examination, that the gap is too wide. But here is what I want to leave you with, because I think it is the most important thing this entire series has been building toward. The generation ship concept, for all its problems, represents something extraordinary about the human species. It represents our refusal to accept that the universe's scale is our limit. It represents our insistence that questions about what lies beyond the horizon, however far that horizon is, however many generations it would take to reach it, are worth asking, worth planning for, worth devoting our intelligence and our creativity and our resources to, even when the honest answer is that we cannot do it. Even when every analytical tool we bring to the problem tells us that the obstacles are not engineering challenges to be solved, but fundamental physical and biological constraints to be reckoned with. The civilizations that survive in the long run, the ones that persist across geological timescales, that extend their reach across the cosmos, are not the ones that accept the current limits of the possible as the permanent limits of the possible. They are the ones that ask, generation after generation, the questions that cannot yet be answered, that build, incrementally, the understanding and the capability that will eventually make the currently impossible merely difficult, that hold, as a cultural inheritance, the conviction that the universe is not a prison but an invitation. We are, right now, approximately 120 years from the first powered flight. In 1903, Wilbur and Orville Wright flew a fragile contraption of wood and fabric for 12 seconds over the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. 66 years later, human beings walked on the moon. The distance between 12 seconds over Kitty Hawk and the surface of the moon, traveled in 66 years, is one of the most extraordinary demonstrations in human history of what sustained, compounding technological progress looks like when a civilization decides that something is worth doing. We are also, right now, approximately 60 years from the first human in space. The universe has had 13.8 billion years of practice at being vast and silent and indifferent. We have had 60 years of practice at sending human beings beyond our atmosphere. The asymmetry is humbling, but the trajectory, the arc from Kitty Hawk to the moon, from Sputnik to the International Space Station, from Voyager's launch to Breakthrough Starshot's funding, that trajectory, if it continues, points somewhere extraordinary. The generation ship may never be built. The problems we have examined across these 10 parts, the genetic bottleneck, the psychological deterioration of isolated communities, the thermodynamic impossibility of perfect closed-loop life support, the Iron Law of Oligarchy playing out across generations of total institutions, the evolutionary and cultural divergence that would make arrivals strangers to their own mission. These are not problems that more funding or more clever engineering will easily resolve. They are problems that reflect deep truths about what living systems require and what human beings are. But the question that the generation ship represents, how do we go? How do we carry what matters most about us across the void between stars? That question is not going away. It will be asked by every generation that looks up at the night sky and feels the pull of what is out there. It will be refined as our understanding of biology deepens, as our propulsion technology advances, as our philosophical frameworks for thinking about identity and consciousness, and what it means to be human become more sophisticated. The answer we give will change. It already has changed, from pure fantasy to engineering thought experiment, to the nuanced and scientifically grounded understanding that we have been building together across these 10 parts. In another century, the answer will be different again, shaped by technologies we cannot currently imagine, by scientific discoveries we have not yet made, by philosophical revolutions we cannot anticipate. What will not change is the question, because the question is not really about spacecraft or propulsion or life support or genetics. The question is about what we are and what we are for, and whether the universe that made us is a universe we have any business trying to inhabit more fully. And the fact that we keep asking it, that we build radio telescopes and launch space probes and fund laser sail research programs and write 10-part video series about the obstacles to interstellar travel, that fact, more than any technology, more than any discovery, is the most compelling evidence we have that the answer, eventually, will be yes. We are stardust that learned to wonder about the stars it came from. That is not nothing. That is in fact everything, and if this blew your mind, you are not done yet. Click the video on your screen right now to explore the real reason interstellar travel is impossible, because what we covered here is only half the story. Trust me, you need to see this one.